Hello, my dear friends. They did not just starve in Victorian Britain. They survived by eating things you would never imagine touching. Behind every bowl, crust and scrap was a world built from desperation and astonishing ingenuity. What people consumed revealed not only hunger, but the hidden rules of a society where food itself became a privilege. Tonight, you'll step into their world and feel what survival tasted on the edge of poverty. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one paused before the bread stalls in the poorest corners of Victorian towns, the scene would reveal a quiet truth about how survival looked for those who lived day to day. The loaves laid out were not fresh or warm, not soft or fragrant, but hardened shapes whose best hours had passed the night before. Vendors called out to passers-by with tired voices, lowering prices as the day faded, knowing well that the poor waited for that moment. They gathered with baskets, cloth bags, or simply their hands, ready to take home whatever the baker no longer wanted. Stale bread was not simply food, it was the thin line that kept hunger from collapsing. Mothers examined each loaf not for quality but for potential. They tapped the crust with their fingernails, listening for the hollow sound that revealed dryness. They weighed the bread in their palms, searching for density, for the promise that it might soften when soaked. Bread did not have to be good. It only had to last long enough to stretch across days when wages were late or illness kept someone from work. Children stood beside their mothers with expressionless faces, already accustomed to the taste of dryness and grit. In homes where choices were few, expectations became small. Inside cramped tenements, the evening ritual repeated itself with quiet resignation. Loaves were broken into pieces, each fragment submerged in water to soften its edges. Sometimes the water was warm from the kettle, often it was cold because fuel was too costly to waste. The bread darkened slightly as the water seeped through its cracks, creating a mush that families ate with spoons when they had them, or with their fingers when they did not. The flavour was nothing more than bland heaviness, but heaviness meant fullness, and fullness meant endurance. People learned to accept what their bodies needed rather than what their mouths wanted. The bread itself travelled a rough journey before ever reaching a home. It sat exposed on market boards covered with dust from coal carts and soot drifting from factories. Rats brushed against baskets at night, and flies gathered in the morning. Vendors handled loaves after touching coins, meat scraps or fish guts. Yet the poor rarely questioned cleanliness. They had no authority to demand better, no spare money to choose differently, and no illusions about what the city offered them. What mattered was quantity, not purity. By late afternoon, the markets were filled with people who waited specifically for the price drop. Bakers, unwilling to waste unsold inventory, stacked old loaves into towering heaps and slashed their cost. Crowds surged toward them not with excitement but with urgency. Bread was the foundation on which each day's survival rested. Everything else, vegetables, broth or meat, was uncertain. Families who could afford nothing else bought as many stale loaves as they could carry, knowing they would have to last until the next chance at work or charity. In many homes, stale bread accompanied water from pumps that were themselves sources of disease. Children tore at hardened crusts with small, tired hands, sometimes dipping the bread into water so cold it numbed their fingers. The sound of crunching echoed in rooms where conversation had dulled into silence. Those who could not chew swallowed pieces whole, letting their stomachs do the labour their jaws could not. Bread filled time as much as it filled bellies. The poorest families often rationed with the precision of soldiers. A loaf became breakfast, dinner, and tomorrow's hope. They cut it into thin slices, cautious not to crumble the edges, and stored the remaining pieces in cloth sacks hung from walls to protect them from rats. Even then, infestation was common. It was normal to brush off bite marks, scrape away mould, and use the rest without hesitation. Waste was a luxury they could not afford. Workhouses offered no relief from this monotony. Meals were structured with mechanical uniformity, a bowl of weak broth and a piece of bread that had already lived several lives before reaching the table. Rows of men, women and children sat with identical portions, eating without complaint because complaint changed nothing. The bread tasted of stone, dust and damp basements, yet it was counted carefully to ensure no one took more than their share. Hunger made people honest in ways comfort never could. Even workers who earned steady wages lived on stale bread more often than they admitted. Long hours in factories did not guarantee fair pay, and unexpected expenses erased savings overnight. For them, bread was practical, easy to carry, enduring, cheap, and filling enough to keep the body standing near machines that demanded constant attention. They tore off chunks during short breaks, chewing quickly before returning to their stations. Bakers themselves walked a thin line between necessity and exploitation. Some helped the poor discreetly, sliding extra scraps into bags or saving loaves that had barely hardened. Others mixed cheaper additives, chalk, plaster, or ground bone, into flour to stretch their supply. These adulterated loaves tasted strange but cost less, and desperate families rarely asked questions. Bread sickened many, weakened more, yet it remained the central thread holding Victorian poverty together. Bread was a promise, even when it was a broken one. Bread shaped the rhythms of entire communities. Women woke early to search for discounted loaves, children carried them home, men ate them on the way to work. Every household knew the weight of hunger pressing against the day. Bread was never merely food, it was a strategy, a defense, a concession to a world structured against the poor. Its presence on the table meant another night survived, another morning possible. Stale bread may seem insignificant today, yet in Victorian streets it stood as the most reliable companion of the desperate. It reflected a city where survival depended not on choice but on endurance, where life weighed itself in crumbs that could be stretched just far enough, not to thrive, but to avoid collapse. Stale bread carried entire families through days when nothing else stood between them and starvation. It showed how survival was built on whatever could be softened, shared, or endured. What followed this meagre meal was even harsher, for the next food many relied upon was nothing more than thin gruel that barely deserved to be called nourishment. The gruel served to the poor in Victorian towns was a liquid so thin and colourless that calling it food felt almost generous. It appeared in workhouses, charity institutions, and the kitchens of families who could afford nothing else. The mixture was made by stirring a handful of oats into a large pot of boiling water, waiting until the grains dissolved into a cloudy broth that carried almost no scent, no richness, and no promise of nourishment. It was a meal built entirely on absence, no fat, no meat, no comfort, and no hope that tomorrow's bowl would be any different. In the cold, echoing halls of workhouses, the preparation of gruel followed the same mechanical rhythm every day. Massive iron pots were filled with water before dawn, their surfaces stained black from years of constant use. Workers added oats by the scoop, though never enough to thicken the mixture. The goal was not to feed, but to stretch. When the liquid reached a weak simmer, it was ladled into tin bowls lined up on wooden tables. The steam rising from the surface suggested warmth, but the warmth was shallow, fleeting, and gone almost as soon as the first spoonful passed the lips. Children in these institutions learned early that gruel was not something to savour. They cupped their bowls with small hands reddened by cold and lifted them carefully, trying not to spill a single drop. The liquid slid easily down their throats, leaving behind a hollowness that grew sharper rather than softer. Breakfast offered no relief. Lunch repeated the same thin broth. Dinner arrived as the same pale imitation of food. Day after day the cycle continued, turning hunger into a constant companion. Some children tried to slow their eating to make the bowl last longer. Others gulped it quickly to end the disappointment sooner. For adults trapped in poverty, the experience was not much different. Their bodies needed strength for long hours in factories, on docks or in mines, yet the gruel offered nothing that could sustain labour. Without fat or meat, it lacked the power to keep muscles firm or minds alert. Workers often felt dizzy by midday, their hands trembling from weakness, though they refused to show it. Admitting hunger was useless. Admitting exhaustion invited punishment. Instead, they moved as best they could, carrying their hollowness with them through every shift. Families who prepared gruel at home worked with even fewer resources. They bought oats in small, crumpled paper packets, often filled with husks and debris. Mothers strained out what they could before stirring the rest into a pot of water. The liquid bubbled quickly, but the smell never changed. Children gathered around the pot as if something miraculous might happen, a flavour, a thicker texture, a rare splash of milk. But the miracle never came. The bowl they received was always the same, warm, thin, and barely more substantial than water. Sugar was a luxury known mostly by name, not by taste. Milk was reserved for infants when it could be found at all. As a result, gruel became a portrait of Victorian poverty in its purest form, a meal made entirely of necessity and stripped of everything that might provide joy. The poor sought comfort in warmth, not flavour. They clung to the bowl on winter mornings when the cold seeped through cracked walls and the breath of an entire family hung visibly in the air. Yet even with its emptiness, gruel remained a staple because it was predictable. When wages failed, when illness kept a parent from working, when food prices rose, or when bread supplies ran short, gruel was the only thing that could be relied upon. It asked for nothing but water and the smallest scattering of oats. The meal was an anchor in lives that drifted constantly towards scarcity, but the physical consequences were impossible to ignore. Children raised on gruel grew slowly, their limbs thin and fragile. Their skin paled, their bones weakened, and their energy faded long before the day ended. Adults lost weight too quickly, their cheeks sinking inward as weeks passed without anything substantial to eat. Factory supervisors dismissed fainting as laziness, unwilling to connect collapse with a diet consisting of little more than flavoured water. The psychological toll was heavy. Gruel carried with it a sense of defeat. Eating it meant accepting that life had narrowed to the barest essentials. Families carried their bowls silently to the table, aware of how thin their survival had become. The meal did not comfort, did not satisfy, did not strengthen. It simply delayed the worst outcome while promising nothing better. Even within this bleak routine, people adapted. Some added scraps of stale bread to thicken the mixture slightly. Others stirred in herbs gathered from roadside patches or used leftover bones to lend the faintest flavour to the broth. These small gestures did not change the nature of the meal, but they restored a sense of control, however fragile. For the poor, small illusions mattered. In the broader picture of Victorian life, gruel exposed a harsh truth. The society prided itself on progress, morality, and industry, yet it allowed entire populations to subsist on food that barely kept them alive. Institutions defending the use of gruel claimed it was economical and efficient, ignoring the human cost. Hunger was treated as a natural condition of poverty, rather than a problem to solve. Gruel endured because it reflected the priorities of the time: keep the poor working, keep expenses low, and keep attention away from suffering that had become too common to provoke outrage. It was a meal without nourishment, purpose, or dignity, yet it remained a constant presence on countless Victorian tables. Gruel revealed how survival often depended on meals that offered warmth but not strength. It showed how the poor lived on liquids barely capable of sustaining a heartbeat. Beyond this thin broth waited another staple of Victorian poverty, a crop dug from the soil that provided more substance than gruel, yet never enough to lift families out of hunger. Potatoes sat at the centre of survival for Victorian labourers, not because they were cherished, but because they were possible. They grew in poor soil, endured cold seasons, and yielded enough food to feed a family when wages failed or work was scarce. In rural districts, fields of potatoes stretched across the landscape like a quiet guarantee that the poorest would not starve outright. In towns, sacks of potatoes appeared in markets long after other produce had gone bad. Their reliability made them indispensable, even when their presence on the table became monotonous, day after day, season after season. For farmers, potatoes were both a blessing and a burden. They required little attention, allowing men and women to tend to other back-breaking tasks, while trusting that the crop beneath the earth would grow with minimal care. Digging them up was often a family effort. Children followed their parents along furrowed rows, gathering misshapen tubers with dirt still clinging to their skin. The harvest brought no celebration. It simply meant there would be something to eat that winter. The poor did not admire potatoes for their flavour or versatility. They respected them because they existed. In working-class homes, potatoes appeared at nearly every meal. They were boiled in iron pots blackened by years of soot, the skins splitting open to reveal pale flesh that steamed gently. Families ate them plain, or sprinkled with a pinch of salt when they could afford it. The meal filled the stomach without offering true satisfaction, but fullness was something few could take for granted. Many workers woke before dawn, ate a boiled potato for breakfast, and carried another in their pockets to eat during brief breaks in the factory. The warmth faded quickly, but the heaviness remained, grounding them just enough to continue through the noise and danger of their shifts. When families felt slightly more fortunate, the potatoes were mashed. Mothers crushed them with wooden spoons, mixing in a small splash of milk when such luxury was available. Most of the time, however, the mash was dry and lumpy, more symbolic of comfort than truly comforting. Children scraped their bowls clean, not because they enjoyed the taste, but because the alternative was going hungry. Even on days when potatoes were the only food in the house, parents found ways to stretch them. Some added water to create a weak potato broth. Others combined leftovers and pan drippings to create something resembling stew. Frying potatoes in lard was considered a treat. The crackle in the pan, the faint aroma rising through the room, and the golden crust forming on each slice offered a brief illusion of richness. Lard itself was precious. It came from pigs raised specifically for survival, and nothing was wasted. When workers could afford a few spoonfuls, they heated them carefully, watching the potatoes sizzle until they softened and browned at the edges. The flavour was stronger, the meal more filling, and for a moment, the household felt the faint echo of comfort. But lard ran out quickly, and fried potatoes became something families remembered rather than expected. Potatoes also served as insurance during the harsh winter months. Stored in cellars, under beds, or in crates packed with straw, they waited silently for the time when the cold would tighten its grip on the city. Work slowed in bad weather, wages dwindled, and bread prices rose. Families who had managed to gather enough potatoes survived by rationing them carefully. A single potato might be cut into quarters, each piece boiled separately to create the illusion of abundance. Hunger made such illusions vital. Despite their importance, potatoes were not free from hardship. Crop failures devastated entire communities. A season of blight could empty cupboards, force families into workhouses, or send children begging in the streets. The memory of famine loomed over every harvest. Even when the crops succeeded, the monotony wore on the spirit. Eating the same food every day turned meals into chores. Children grew thin, their bodies craving nutrients potatoes could not provide. Adults aged quickly, their strength eroded by diets that sustained but never nourished. Yet potatoes held a strange position in Victorian society. They were seen as the food of the poor, a marker of one's social position. The wealthy rarely touched them, preferring breads, meats, and pastries. In contrast, the poor consumed them with resignation. Their affordability made them both essential and symbolic. To eat potatoes daily was to acknowledge one's place at the bottom of the social ladder. To rely on them entirely was to accept a life shaped by scarcity. Still, potatoes remained dependable. They resisted rot better than bread, offered more substance than gruel, and grew where other crops refused. Their flexibility kept families alive. They could be boiled, mashed, fried, baked, or thrown into stews made from scraps. Some households grated them to make rough cakes fried in iron pans. Others mixed them with flour to stretch the dough further. Creativity often arose from desperation, and potatoes provided the raw material for that creativity. Urban labourers bought potatoes in small quantities each day, just enough to avoid spoilage. Street vendors sold them cheaply, sometimes roasting them over open coals and offering them to passers-by wrapped in scraps of newspaper. Workers warmed their hands around the hot potatoes on cold evenings before eating them whole, skin and all. The heat soothed their fingers, while the starch settled heavily in their stomachs. It was a warmth that lasted only briefly, but even brief warmth mattered. In the broader context of Victorian poverty, potatoes became a quiet emblem of endurance. They did not inspire gratitude or joy. They simply existed, like the chimneys that never stopped smoking, or the narrow streets that never stopped filling with people seeking work. Potatoes were the food of survival, unremarkable, unexciting, and unavoidable. They stood between the poor and starvation, offering just enough to keep a person moving forward. Potatoes sustained countless families who lived on the very edge of hunger, offering a heaviness that kept bodies standing through long, punishing days. Their reliability made them indispensable, even though they brought no comfort beyond temporary fullness. But beyond this humble root waited something darker, for many Victorian families turned to vegetables so wilted and discarded that their meals were built from what the markets no longer wanted. Vegetable broth made from discarded market scraps was one of the most common meals among the Victorian poor, not because it offered comfort, but because it was the only form of warmth many families could afford. Markets at the end of the day became treasure grounds for those who carried baskets and hope in equal measure. Vendors swept wilted leaves, bruised stems, and hardened stalks into piles, preparing to throw them away. Before they could do so, however, the poorest slipped in to gather what remained. These remnants had lost their colour, crispness, and taste, yet they held one essential promise. They could be boiled into something warm enough to trick the body into believing it had eaten. Most of the scraps found in the markets were barely vegetables at all. Leaves drooped like wet cloth, their edges browned and curling inward. Carrot tops snapped off easily, revealing pale, fibrous centres. Cabbage leaves tore apart in the hands of anyone who picked them up. Yet in the kitchens of the poor, these fragments were rinsed carefully in cold water drawn from pumps or wells. Dirt clung stubbornly to their surfaces, and small insects sometimes floated to the top of the basin. People picked them out quietly, knowing that complaining would not change what little they had to work with. Clean enough was the only measure that mattered. The cooking process was simple but long, an act of patience rather than skill. A pot was filled with water, often the only ingredient available in abundance, and placed over a modest fire. Mothers and grandmothers dropped vegetable pieces one by one, listening to the faint hiss as the water absorbed their bitterness. When families had salt, they used it sparingly. A pinch added to the pot felt like a luxury, not because of its flavour, but because it made the broth feel intentional, almost like a real meal. Those without salt turned to wild herbs found near roadsides or along the riverbank, though these often had strong medicinal flavours rather than anything resembling comfort. The resulting broth was thin, cloudy, and inconsistent. Sometimes the vegetables disintegrated completely, leaving behind only a faint green tint in the water. Other times they softened into stringy clumps that floated aimlessly at the surface. But despite its appearance, the broth carried warmth, and warmth mattered more than taste. During harsh winters, when frost crept through the cracks of tenement walls and breath hung in the air like smoke, even a bowl of weak broth felt like survival. People cupped their hands around the bowl, using the heat to thaw fingers stiffened by hours of cold. Families ate slowly, not because they savoured the flavour, but because they wanted the warmth to last as long as possible. Children slurped, their faces reddened by steam rising from the pot. Adults remained quiet, aware that the small amount of food before them had to be shared carefully. Broth did not fill the stomach, but it eased the sharpest edge of hunger and allowed people to sleep without the gnawing pain that otherwise kept them awake. Many nights the warmth of broth was the only comfort available. The absence of meat in these meals was not a choice. Meat was expensive, scarce, and far beyond the reach of most households. Even bones, once discarded freely, began to be sold by butchers when they realised the poor would pay a few coins just to make their broth less watery. For those who could not afford even bones, vegetable scraps became the foundation of every meal. They stretched them by boiling the same pot more than once, adding water each time until the flavour faded to nothing. The broth thinned with each reheating, but families continued to drink it until the last trace of warmth was gone. Gathering vegetables for broth was a daily ritual shaped by desperation. People arrived at the market early enough to find vendors who were sympathetic or careless. Some sellers looked away as the poor collected leaves that had begun to rot. Others shooed them off, forcing them to return after dark when the market emptied, and shadows made it easier to search through what remained. Nighttime scavenging was cold and humiliating, yet it was often the only chance to bring home something edible. Children learned quickly how to move quietly around stalls, picking up scraps without angering those who still had goods to sell. In many households, broth also served as a way to hide the absence of food. A pot simmering on the stove created the illusion of abundance. Neighbours visiting unannounced might assume the family had vegetables to spare, even when the pot held nothing more than boiled stems and leaves softened beyond recognition. Pride persisted even when hunger dominated daily life. People wanted to appear capable, even when the truth was far more fragile. Despite its weaknesses, vegetable broth had one undeniable virtue. It was warm. Warmth was rare in Victorian winters, especially for families who had no coal for their stoves or only enough to light a small fire. The broth's heat, however limited, offered a moment of relief from the bitter weather. When darkness fell early and the cold pressed through rooftops and window frames, a single pot of broth could bring the family together around the table, their hands wrapped around mismatched bowls, steam softening their exhaustion for a brief moment. In the broader landscape of Victorian poverty, broth made from discarded vegetables symbolised not just scarcity, but resilience. It showed how families turned waste into sustenance, how they bent their expectations to match what life allowed, and how hunger shaped a kind of ingenuity that was as heartbreaking as it was necessary. The broth did not nourish, did not strengthen, and did not heal, but it warmed, and many nights warmth was the only thing standing between survival and despair. This fragile broth kept families alive through the coldest nights, offering warmth without nourishment and comfort without substance. It revealed how survival depended on scraps that others deemed worthless. Yet even this humble meal faded in comparison to what came next, for the poor soon turned to foods heavy with fat and desperation, dishes meant to fill the stomach even as they burdened the body. Animal fat pudding was one of the heaviest foods the Victorian poor relied on, a dish born not from abundance but from the simple need to stay full for as long as possible. It began with flour, often coarse, grey, and mixed with impurities, combined with beef or pork fat scraped from butcher scraps. The fat was the true heart of the pudding. It held the mixture together, added weight, and provided enough density to keep hunger quiet for hours. Families who could not afford meat bought small chunks of fat instead, trimming and melting them down until they became soft enough to blend into the dough. The mixture was then steamed or baked, forming a dense block that sat on the table like a promise of temporary relief. The finished pudding was heavy in the hands, almost solid enough to be mistaken for stone. When cut, the slices glistened slightly from the fat trapped inside. The texture was thick and chewy, requiring effort to eat, and the taste was plain unless salt was available, which was often a luxury. Yet for all its simplicity, the pudding offered something rare. It stayed in the stomach. Unlike broth or stale bread, which faded quickly into hunger, this pudding lingered. A few bites could carry a worker through half a day of labour, providing the slow, heavy energy needed to lift crates, operate machines, or walk long distances in the cold. Cooking the pudding was often an all-day process. In crowded tenement kitchens, mothers mixed flour and fat in wooden bowls worn smooth from years of use. The dough absorbed the warmth of their hands as they shaped it into rough loaves. When steamed, the pudding sat for hours inside iron pots, the lid rattling gently as boiling water heated the thick mass inside. The steam filled the room with an oily smell that clung to clothes and walls. Neighbours who walked past the door knew instantly what was being cooked. The scent meant survival more than indulgence. Because of its richness, the pudding was rarely eaten fresh from the pot. Instead, families allowed it to cool and firm, cutting it into thick pieces that could last for days. Each slice was wrapped in cloth or stored in metal tins to be eaten whenever hunger struck. Workers carried these slices in their pockets, warming them with body heat and eating them during short breaks. Children chewed on them after school or workhouse chores, their jaws aching from the density. The pudding did not spoil quickly, and that alone made it valuable. But the heaviness that made the pudding so useful also made it burdensome. The fat sat in the stomach like a weight, pressing down long after the meal ended. Many felt sluggish after eating it, their bodies labouring to digest the dense mixture. Some experienced stomach pain, especially when the fat came from older animals or scraps beginning to turn rancid. But the poor accepted this discomfort because the alternative, constant hunger, was worse. The pudding was not meant for enjoyment. It was meant for endurance. In winter, animal fat pudding became even more essential. Cold weather drained energy rapidly, and workers burned calories simply by surviving freezing temperatures. A warm slice of pudding eaten before dawn could make the difference between collapsing on a job site and completing a shift. Families gathered around steaming pots, their faces illuminated by dim candlelight as they waited for the first slice to be cut. The pudding's warmth lingered in the room even after the pot was emptied, creating a momentary sense of comfort that disappeared as soon as the fire died. Though simple, the dish varied slightly depending on what each family could gather. Some added small pieces of dried fruit when they were lucky enough to find them cheaply. Others incorporated leftover broth or bits of stale bread to stretch the mixture further. Many made do with whatever fat they could obtain: beef drippings, pork trimmings, or even fat skimmed from someone else's discarded cooking water. These additions did little to change the core identity of the pudding, a survival food built from necessity. The pudding also reflected the harsh divisions of Victorian society. Among the wealthy, puddings were sweet, rich, and filled with spices or fruits. Among the poor, they were plain, oily blocks of sustenance. To taste sweetness was beyond the reach of most labourers. To have a pudding with flavour was a luxury reserved for holidays or charity meals. Most families never tasted such richness, and children grew up believing pudding was supposed to be heavy, greasy, and bland. As days passed, the pudding hardened. Slices left overnight became tough and rubbery. Families softened them by frying the pieces in leftover lard or boiling them briefly in water. These methods helped revive the texture, but they could not change the flavour. Still, the children ate without complaint. Hunger made every bite valuable, and the pudding's durability meant no scrap was wasted. Animal fat pudding became a symbol of how the Victorian poor managed to survive with limited resources. It was not a dish of pleasure or pride. It was a tool, a way to keep the body functioning in a world that demanded endless labour and offered little nourishment in return. Heavy, oily, and unchanging, the pudding matched the rhythm of life for those who lived closest to hunger. This dense pudding sustained families through long, punishing days, offering slow-burning fullness even as it weighed heavily on the body. It showed how survival depended on foods that filled more than they nourished. And what followed this heavy staple grew even bleaker. For many poor households soon turned to slaughterhouse scraps, the unwanted remnants of animals that became their last defence against starvation. The scraps that came from Victorian slaughterhouses were never meant to be food, yet for the poor they became the closest thing to protein they could hope for. These leftovers, organs, bones, ears, hooves and trimmings, stripped of every trace of valuable meat, piled up behind the killing floors in heaps that smelled of iron and decay. Butchers sold the best cuts to wealthy families and middle-class homes, leaving only the remnants behind, and it was these remnants that the poor gathered, cleaned, boiled, and transformed into meals that kept them alive, even as they offered little comfort. The contrast between what they wanted and what they were forced to eat revealed the harsh divide that shaped everyday life. Approaching a slaughterhouse meant stepping into an assault on the senses. The air was thick with blood-soaked steam, the ground slick with water and grease, and the walls stained from years of labour. Workers moved quickly, their aprons dripping, their knives flashing under dim light. With every animal processed, a fresh pile of discarded parts grew. These scraps were sold cheaply in buckets or shoveled into sacks, not because they held culinary value, but because poor families would buy whatever they could afford. Children waiting outside learned early not to flinch at the sight of raw organs or broken bones. Hunger made them practical. Bones were perhaps the most sought after. Even stripped clean, they carried marrow deep within the centre, a richness inaccessible without hours of boiling. Families placed these bones into large pots, covering them with water and letting them simmer for half a day. The resulting broth was cloudy and thin, but it contained enough fat to coat the lips and warm the chest. Mothers skimmed the surface carefully, saving every drop of oil. The bones were reused until they turned chalk white and crumbled between the fingers. Only then were they discarded. Organs such as lungs, stomach linings, and trimmings of liver often appeared in the kitchens of the poor. They were tough, elastic, and unpleasant to smell, especially when old. Before cooking, families soaked them in water, scraping away clots or bits of hair left from the slaughter. The boiling softened the organs slightly, transforming them into something edible only through persistence. When mixed with flour and fat, they created a thick, lumpy paste that resembled pâté only in the vaguest sense. Spread on stale bread, the mixture provided protein, even if its taste lingered unpleasantly long after the meal ended. Ears and hooves required even more preparation. Long hours of simmering were necessary to break down the tough cartilage. The resulting gelatin-enriched soups offer a small illusion of luxury. Children often chewed on the softened pieces for minutes at a time, not for flavour, but for texture. The gelatin clung to their fingers, cooling quickly into a pale, wobbling mass. It was a strange food, neither enjoyable nor hateful, simply a part of survival. Nothing that came from a slaughterhouse went unused. Fat scraps, once trimmed from cuts intended for wealthier homes, were melted down into drippings. These drippings flavoured potatoes or thickened broth, adding a richness the poor rarely tasted elsewhere. The smell of melted fat drifted through the narrow streets around tenements, drawing the attention of hungry neighbours. Fat was precious. It kept bodies warm and provided the energy necessary for long days of labour. A spoonful added to a pot could transform an otherwise empty broth into something sustaining. For many families, scavenging played a major role in obtaining these scraps. When they had no coins, they waited near the back doors of slaughterhouses for workers to toss out unusable parts. It was dangerous work. Knives flashed, animals kicked, and carts rattled through the alleyways, yet the poor learned to slip in and gather what they could. Children, smaller and quicker, often climbed ahead of adults to grab pieces before they hit the ground. Every scrap collected meant another day with something in the pot. The meals made from these scraps were dense, heavy, and difficult to digest. Their richness came from fat rather than nutrients, and their strength came from boiling rather than freshness. Many experienced stomach pains, indigestion, or sickness, especially when the scraps were old. But in Victorian poverty, the body accepted what the mind resisted. Complaints were rare. People ate in silence, aware that questioning the quality of food they depended on was pointless. There were no alternatives. Slaughterhouse scraps also carried emotional weight. They reminded the poor of their position in society, at the end of every hierarchy, consuming what others discarded. The wealthy spoke of progress, charity, and morality, while the poor scraped fat from bones stripped clean for aristocratic tables. The contrast was stark. One world feasted while the other boiled hooves for dinner. Children grew up believing this imbalance was natural because they had never known anything else. Even so, these scraps kept families alive through cold winters and periods of unemployment. When workhouses offered gruel too thin to sustain a person, slaughterhouse leftovers provided the heaviness needed to survive. Families shared their pots with neighbours, spreading the meagre richness as far as possible. The broth simmering on the stove symbolised both struggle and endurance. Slaughterhouse scraps did not nourish in the way food should, but they filled the void hunger carved out each day. They stood as a grim testament to the resourcefulness of those who refused to surrender to starvation, turning cast-offs into meals that prolonged life even when they offered no comfort. These scraps, boiled and scraped until nothing remained, kept families alive by giving them just enough strength to continue each day. They showed how survival depended on transforming waste into sustenance. What emerged after this grim reliance was a different kind of hardship. For many poor families turned next to dried or salted fish, so tough and pungent that eating it became an act of endurance rather than nourishment. Dried and salted fish became one of the most persistent foods among the Victorian poor, not because it was enjoyable, but because it lasted. Small herring, tiny catfish, and other cheap varieties were dredged in coarse salt until their skins stiffened and their bodies shrank. This preservation made them nearly immortal on the shelf, able to survive long journeys from coastal towns to crowded industrial districts. For families living day to day, the durability mattered more than flavour. They bought fish that smelled sharply of brine and metal, fish so rigid that snapping one in half felt like breaking a stick. Yet these harsh pieces of protein carried enough nourishment to keep a worker standing or a child from fainting at midday. Market stalls selling salted fish were easy to find by scent alone. The air around them hung heavy with the sharp sting of salt and the sourness of aged flesh. Vendors arranged rows of stiff fish on wooden planks, their silver scales dulled by drying and their eyes clouded to pale marbles. Customers examined them with practiced indifference, choosing the cheapest pieces rather than the freshest. Freshness was never an expectation. The poor did not buy fish for pleasure, they bought it for survival, knowing that despite its toughness, it contained oil and protein their diets sorely lacked. Preparing the fish was its own ordeal. Families soaked the pieces in water to draw out the overwhelming salt, though the brine never fully left. The fish softened slightly, but remained chewy, fibrous and resistant under the teeth. Mothers shredded them into thin strips to mix into potatoes or gruel, stretching the small amount of protein across as many bowls as possible. A single salted fish could flavour an entire pot of food, even if the flavour was more punishment than reward. Children often wrinkled their noses at the strong scent, yet they ate without complaint, aware that refusing food was a luxury reserved for those who were never hungry. In households where potatoes were the main staple, salted fish served as the rare companion that made the meal feel complete. The heaviness of potatoes balanced the sharpness of the fish, creating a combination familiar across poor neighbourhoods. Men ate this mixture early in the morning before hours of factory work, the salt drawing moisture from their bodies but granting a brief sense of fullness. Women ate it late at night when chores were finished, using its lingering oil to sustain them until dawn. For children, even a small bite brought energy that gruel or stale bread could not offer. Despite its nutritional value, salted fish came with problems. Its dryness made it difficult for the elderly to chew, and its salt content caused stomach pain for those unaccustomed to such intensity. Some families soaked the fish overnight, changing the water multiple times in hopes of softening the texture. Others fried it in leftover fat, if they could spare any, allowing the edges to crisp and the smell to settle slightly. But even these efforts failed to erase the toughness completely. Eating salted fish always felt like a negotiation between hunger and discomfort. In winter, when food supplies thinned and markets struggled to restock, salted fish became even more important. Its long shelf life made it a dependable resource when fresh goods disappeared from stalls. Workers saved small coins specifically for fish, knowing they would outlast bread and vegetables. Mothers hid pieces in cloth bundles or metal tins, protecting them from mice, damp air, or the temptation of eating them too quickly. A household that had salted fish tucked away felt a sense of security, however fragile. The journey of salted fish from coastal regions to industrial cities reflected the broader structure of Victorian life. Coastal workers preserved fish to sell cheaply to inland townships, feeding populations too poor to buy anything fresh. The salted fish that arrived in London, Manchester or Birmingham was often the lowest grade available, the leftovers of leftovers. By the time it reached the hands of the poor, it had passed through countless intermediaries, each taking their cut while leaving the poorest with the harshest, driest product. Still, the poor accepted it because it was one of the few foods that offered real nourishment. Children grew up familiar with the ritual of eating dried fish. They would peel small strips free with their fingers, chewing slowly as the salt burned their tongues. The fish left a persistent smell on their breath, on their clothes, even on their bedding. No amount of washing could fully erase it. Yet the smell became part of the rhythm of poverty, one more marker of a life tied to necessity. In crowded tenements, the scent mixed with coal smoke, damp cloth, and the mustiness of overcrowded rooms until it became almost invisible. Some families tried to soften the harshness by pairing the fish with porridge. Stirring shredded fish into gruel thickened the mixture slightly and provided a rare depth of flavour. The combination was salty, oily, and intense, but it delivered calories to bodies that needed every bit of strength they could muster. For labourers working double shifts, the fish and gruel mixture became a kind of crude fuel, sustaining them when rest and real food were impossible. Even so, salted fish underscored the imbalance between classes. While the wealthy enjoyed fresh salmon, seasoned cod, or buttery fish pies, the poor gnawed on leathery scraps preserved in salt thick enough to burn their mouths. The divide was not just culinary, but symbolic, a daily reminder that even the sea's abundance was not offered to all equally. What the poor consumed bore little resemblance to the fish served in elegant dining rooms, lit by candles and warmed by thick carpets. Despite its drawbacks, salted fish endured because hunger granted it purpose. It was a compromise that kept countless families alive, a hard-edged food that carried within it the quiet determination of those who refused to be broken by scarcity. This harsh, briny fish kept bodies moving when other foods failed, giving strength even as it demanded discomfort in return. It revealed how survival often meant accepting meals that punished the senses while sustaining the flesh. The next threat lurking on Victorian tables was far more deceptive, for even the bread the poor relied upon was laced with dangerous fillers that turned each loaf into a hidden risk they could neither detect nor escape. Brown bread in Victorian cities was never as honest as it looked. Its dark colour suggested wholesome grain, its weight implied substance, and its low price made it one of the few foods the poor could buy without hesitation. But behind this familiar staple lay a practice so widespread that even government inspectors struggled to stop it. Bakers, eager to stretch their flour and maximise profit, mixed sawdust, gypsum, clay, and other cheap fillers into their dough. These additions made each loaf heavier, denser, and more profitable, even if they turned bread into something closer to building material than food. For the poor, who purchased bread daily because it was the foundation of their diet, this adulteration shaped their lives in ways they could neither avoid nor fully understand. The appearance of the bread encouraged trust. A loaf with a dark crust seemed rich in whole grains, the kind of bread that could keep a labourer satisfied through long hours of work. The weight felt reassuring in the hand, as if one were getting more for the precious coins exchanged. But this heaviness came from gypsum powder, clay dust, or even powdered stone ground so fine it blended seamlessly with the flour. Bakers pressed the loaves into tight shapes, masking cracks or inconsistencies that might suggest contamination. Presented neatly on wooden shelves or cloth-lined baskets, the bread looked almost respectable. Hunger did not leave room for suspicion. Inside the cramped homes of the poor, this bread became the centerpiece of every meal. Families sliced it into thin pieces to make it last, even as the texture revealed its secret. The crumb felt gritty, like sand pressed into dough. Moisture lingered unnaturally, causing the bread to mold quickly, especially in humid, overcrowded rooms. Mothers scraped away green spots and served the rest, hoping the children would not notice. They often did, but noticing was not the same as refusing. Bread was bread. The body needed food more than comfort. The physical effects were immediate and persistent. Bread filled with mineral powders was heavy on the stomach, sitting like a stone long after the meal ended. Workers frequently complained of cramps or bloating, though few associated these pains with the bread itself. Children grew thin despite eating daily, their bodies unable to draw much nutrition from the adulterated loaves. Constipation was common, as was chronic fatigue. Doctors saw these symptoms across the poorest districts, yet without proper tools to test food, they struggled to pinpoint a cause. Illness simply became another part of poverty. For bakers, the temptation to cheat was constant. Genuine flour was expensive, especially during poor harvests, and competition among bakery shops was fierce. Adding fillers allowed them to lower prices while still turning a profit. Many insisted their methods were harmless, claiming their bread was no different from any other. Customers who complained were dismissed as ignorant or ungrateful. In truth, the practice was so widespread that a baker who refused to adulterate might find themselves unable to compete. Cheating became not an exception, but an expectation. Government inspectors occasionally launched investigations, spurred by rising complaints or reports of illness. They visited bakeries, collected samples, and condemned the most blatant violators. But their efforts rarely made a lasting difference. Testing methods were crude, easily deceived by careful mixing or temporary compliance. Bakeries fined one month resumed their adulteration the next. Even when newspapers reported shocking findings, bread filled with chalk, plaster, or worse, the public response was limited. The poor continued buying the same loaves because no alternative existed. Regulations without enforcement did little to change daily life. The relationship between the poor and their bread became one of uneasy resignation. Bread was supposed to sustain, not sabotage. Yet each slice carried risks no one could detect with the naked eye. Parents watched their children eat, knowing the loaf was far from ideal, but unable to afford anything better. The wealthy dined on white loaves made from fine flour, soft and fragrant, while the poor chewed through grit and clay. Bread revealed the social divide more clearly than any law or census. Still, the adulterated loaves played a crucial role in survival. Their density made them filling, even when their quality made them harmful. They absorbed broth, stretched leftovers, and softened the harshness of salted fish or organ pâté. A single loaf could carry a family through an entire day. Mothers rationed slices with mathematical precision, measuring hunger against scarcity. Bread became both a burden and a lifeline, a contradiction at the centre of Victorian poverty. The most tragic part was how normalised the deceit became. Entire communities consumed bread knowing it was flawed, accepting discomfort as the cost of staying alive. The problem persisted for decades, outlasting political promises and public outrage. It symbolised a deeper truth. In a society where wealth determined safety, even the simplest foods could turn hostile. This heavy, gritty bread forced families to accept danger with every bite, shaping their days through discomfort and necessity. It revealed how survival often meant submitting to foods that harmed as much as they helped. Looming ahead was an even bleaker reality. For many children survived only by scavenging scraps from market refuse, a desperate practice that exposed the raw edge of Victorian hunger. Children wandering through Victorian markets lived in a world where hunger shaped every instinct. They learned early that food was not something given, but something found, in gutters, in refuse bins, in the chaotic spaces beneath crowded stalls. These children did not browse markets the way paying customers did. They watched from shadows, waiting for a vegetable to fall, a crust of bread to be discarded, a vendor to turn away for even a moment. What others considered waste became their daily sustenance. Their survival depended on quick hands, sharp eyes, and the ability to disappear before anyone noticed what they had taken. Market mornings were the busiest. Vendors rushed to set up their goods, stacking baskets of wilted greens, bruised fruit, stale bread, and yesterday's fish. In this frenzy, children circled like small, hungry birds, each movement calculated. A dropped carrot or a handful of torn leaves meant another hour without pain in the stomach. They grabbed whatever they could find: apple peels, potato skins, crumbs swept from breadboards, or wilted cabbage leaves thrown aside after trimming. Nothing was too insignificant. If it could be chewed, it counted as food. Trash bins behind stalls served as their most reliable resource. Inside lay pieces of fruit too bruised for sale, bread too stale to tempt even the poorest buyers, and vegetables trimmed of their edible ends. Children dug through this refuse with practiced precision, ignoring the smell, the insects, and the filth. They pulled out anything that still held a trace of nourishment. Many ate these scraps immediately, wiping them on their sleeves before swallowing. Others tucked finds into pockets to share with younger siblings waiting at home. But scavenging was only half the struggle. Some children relied on brief moments of opportunity. The instant a vendor looked away, the second a customer blocked a stall owner's view. During these tiny windows, a child's hand would dart out to snatch a crust or a fallen onion, then vanish into the crowd. The act required nerve, speed, and silence. Getting caught meant slaps, kicks, or public humiliation. Vendors believed they were protecting their livelihood, but the children were simply trying not to starve. These small thieves developed strategies out of necessity. They learned which stalls had the most waste, which vendors were too busy to notice them, and which corners of the market served as blind spots. They followed carts carrying spoiled produce to the dumping sites outside the market walls, racing other children to reach the piles first. They memorized the schedule of bread deliveries, hoping for crumbs dropped during transport. Hunger sharpened their awareness more effectively than any formal instruction. Despite the constant danger of punishment, most children scavenged openly among others just like them. Markets filled with clusters of thin, barefoot figures, their clothes patched beyond recognition, their faces streaked with dust. They shared tips and sometimes shared food, especially with the youngest, who could not fend for themselves. Starvation created bonds as easily as it created desperation. Even so, Every child understood that tomorrow's meal was never guaranteed. Illness often followed the food they found. Spoiled fruit caused stomach pain, mouldy bread led to infections, and unwashed scraps introduced parasites. Yet children had no choice but to eat whatever they could salvage. Their bodies adapted to hardship, though never fully. Many carried signs of chronic malnutrition, hollow cheeks, swollen joints, and stunted growth. Their hunger was not temporary, it was the backdrop of their existence. Adult passers-by rarely intervened. Poverty was so widespread that hungry children became part of the scenery. People stepped around them without thought, assuming their condition was natural or inevitable. Only a few offered leftover food or spare coins, gestures too rare to rely on. Most market workers viewed the children as nuisances, not victims. The divide between those who had enough to eat and those who lived from refuse marked one of the starkest boundaries in Victorian society. For the children who survived this life, the market became a classroom in endurance. They learned the rhythms of commerce, the habits of crowds, and the cruel fact that the world offered them scraps because scraps were all it believed they deserved. Their lives were shaped by the sound of vendors shouting prices, the sight of food just out of reach, and the constant pressure of hunger pushing them from one corner to the next. Yet even in this harsh environment, moments of relief appeared. On rare days when several vendors discarded large amounts of unsellable produce, children gathered quietly to share their findings. A bruised apple split among 3 siblings felt like a feast. A half-eaten loaf dropped by a customer became a treasure. These were small victories, but they kept the children moving, searching, hoping. These children survived by turning waste into meals, relying on speed, instinct, and desperation to fill their stomachs each day. Their hunger exposed how deeply Victorian society failed its youngest and most vulnerable. Ahead lay an equally unsettling reality. For some families depended on shops that sold leftovers from the rich, meagre portions that revealed how even charity could become another form of scarcity. Shops that sold leftovers from wealthy households were some of the strangest fixtures in Victorian cities, places where the divide between classes became visible in the most literal way. These small, dim storefronts offered what the rich did not finish: cold porridge scraped from silver bowls, wilted vegetables left untouched after dinner, hardened pastries that once decorated lavish tables. For the poor, these scraps were a rare chance to taste foods far beyond their means. They waited in long lines outside the doors, clutching their coins, hoping anything remained by the time it was their turn. Leftovers became not just food, but a fragile link to a world from which they were otherwise entirely excluded. Inside these shops, the air held a mix of scents: the sourness of cooled stews, the sweetness of stale cakes, the faint metallic smell of containers used too many times. Workers behind the counter portioned the leftovers into tiny servings, each spoonful carefully measured. Customers received their allotments without complaint, knowing that questioning the size of their portion might mean losing it altogether. The system was rigid: no bargaining, no substitutions, no extra bites. A few pennies bought whatever the shop had been given that morning, and sometimes that meant a meal that was barely more than a taste. The quality of the food varied wildly. A wealthy household might send leftover roast vegetables or pieces of bread still soft enough to enjoy. But just as often, the offerings were meagre. Porridge so stiff it held its shape, greens boiled until they lost all colour, gravy that had congealed into a fatty crust. Yet everything was taken. Hunger left no room for preference, and the poor swallowed whatever ended up in their hands. They knew that even a spoonful of leftover stew might provide more nourishment than anything they could prepare at home. The lines outside these shops reflected the desperation of entire communities. Elderly widows, thin labourers, mothers holding children who had gone a full day without food, they all gathered with the same uneasy hope. Many arrived before dawn, fearing that the leftovers would run out. Once inside, they clutched their small containers tightly, guarding their portions from the crowd. Some carried old jars, others wrapped their food in cloth, and a few simply balanced it in their palms until they reached somewhere safe to eat. There was a strange dignity attached to these leftovers. Although they were scraps, they came from affluent kitchens, places with fine porcelain, polished silver, and meals prepared by professional cooks. To the poor, this connection made the food feel special. Eating a bite of cold pastry or vegetable stew felt like stepping briefly into the world of those who never knew hunger. It did not matter that the food was old or unappealing. What mattered was where it came from. For many, it was the closest they would ever get to tasting food of the rich. Yet this quiet admiration came with an undercurrent of humiliation. The very existence of these shops revealed how deeply unequal Victorian society had become. The wealthy discarded more food in a single meal than some families ate in a week. While the rich forgot the dishes they had barely touched, the poor scraped every bit of gravy from their bowls. People walked home carefully, carrying their portions as if they were treasures, while knowing full well that what they held had once been deemed unworthy of a wealthy table. Children often waited with their parents in these lines, watching the workers portion out food. They learned early that fortune did not mean abundance, but access. Access to leftovers, access to opportunities, access to whatever might keep them alive another day. They tasted these scraps with excitement, even joy, unaware of the social cruelty embedded in each bite. What mattered to them was that the food was different from their usual meals of potatoes or stale bread. Even cold porridge tasted luxurious when it came from a wealthy household. Conditions inside the shops were harsh. Crowds pressed together in the narrow spaces, the smell of old food growing stronger as bodies filled the room. Workers moved quickly, aware that lingering too long might cause unrest. Tempers flared easily, not out of anger, but desperation. People who had waited for hours feared leaving empty-handed, and any delay felt like a threat. Hunger shaped every action, every expression, every breath. Despite all of this, these shops became essential pillars of survival. They provided food at a fraction of the cost, requiring only a few coins that even the poorest could sometimes gather. In neighborhoods where employment was unstable and food prices rose unpredictably, leftovers were often the difference between eating and going hungry. For many families, it was the only chance to experience meals that resembled those of better-off households, even if only faintly. But this system also revealed an uncomfortable truth. The rich produced enough waste to sustain the poor. Scraps travelled from polished dining rooms to crowded tenements, forming a chain of dependence built on inequality. The poor survived on what the wealthy ignored, turning luxury into necessity through sheer need. These leftovers sustained families by offering brief contact with foods they could never afford, even as each bite underscored the vast gulf between privilege and poverty. They showed how survival often meant relying on what others cast aside. Yet another layer of this harsh reality awaited in the cups of weak tea the poor drank daily, a thin warmth that replaced real nourishment when food ran out. Cheap, watered-down tea became one of the most common lifelines for the Victorian poor, a drink that offered neither true nourishment nor strength, yet carried just enough warmth to quiet an empty stomach. For families who could not afford regular meals, tea functioned as both comfort and illusion. A single handful of leaves might be reused across several days, steeped again and again, until the liquid resembled nothing more than tinted water. Still, the ritual of drinking it provided something the poor desperately needed, a sense of momentary relief, however fragile. Early mornings in tenement rooms almost always began with the sound of boiling water. Mothers heated small kettles over weak fires, the flames barely strong enough to warm the metal. Into this water they dropped tea leaves that had already been used twice, sometimes 3 times. The resulting brew was pale, thin, and nearly flavourless, but the steam spiralling upward brought a sense of life into rooms otherwise cold and damp. Families cupped their hands around tin mugs, inhaling the faint aroma of tea, as though it were richer than it truly was. Drinking it did not fill their bodies with energy, yet it softened the sharp edge of hunger just enough to continue through the morning. Tea became a substitute for breakfast, because a real breakfast was rare. Bread costs money, oats cost money, milk costs money. Hot water and old tea leaves were far cheaper. Children often left the house with nothing more than this watery drink warming their stomachs. It brought them a few hours of alertness before hunger returned. Adults relied on the same trick. Labourers heading to factories sipped weak tea before long shifts, knowing it was the only warmth they would feel until midday. The illusion of fullness, however brief, made it easier to keep moving. The teapots used in these homes told their own story. Stained, cracked, and blackened by constant reuse, they held leaves that were never truly thrown away. Families dried the leaves after each brewing, spreading them on cloth or window ledges so they could be used again. Some even mixed the spent leaves with fresh ones, pretending to restore flavour. The truth, however, remained unchanged. Each steeping drew more bitterness from the leaves and less comfort for the drinker. Street vendors also played a role in this ritual. In crowded markets and alleys, poor workers could buy a cup of weak tea for a single penny. Vendors prepared massive batches using the cheapest leaves available, boiling them until no flavour remained. The tea tasted metallic, often carrying traces of soot from the coal fires used to heat it. Yet people lined up for it, not for taste but for warmth. Holding a hot cup in cold weather was worth the cost. Even children saved coins for this small luxury, cradling the cups in both hands as if the heat alone could sustain them. For many, tea became deeply symbolic. It represented resilience, a way to push through long days despite lacking food. It also revealed how drastically poverty reshaped ordinary rituals. For wealthier families, tea was an indulgence with cakes, fine china, and conversation. For the poor, it was a survival strategy, stripped of ceremony, stripped of comfort, stripped of all but the barest hint of what tea was meant to be. The same drink that signified refinement in drawing rooms signified endurance in tenements. The physical effects of relying on watered-down tea were mixed. The heat provided temporary relief from cold homes and damp clothing. The bitterness helped dull hunger. But the lack of nutrients left bodies underfed, especially children whose growth depended on real nourishment. Some felt jittery from the tannins when the tea was overly steeped. Others developed headaches from consuming too much liquid in place of food. Yet these discomforts were accepted quietly. Complaining about tea was pointless when nothing else could take its place. Tea also shaped social life among the poor. Neighbours visited one another to share a kettle, each contributing a pinch of spent leaves. Mothers comforted crying children with small sips of warm tea when no food remained. Workers exchanged short breaks over mugs, allowing themselves brief moments of rest before returning to exhausting labour. The ritual did not ease their circumstances, but it softened the loneliness of hardship. In winter, weak tea became essential. It warmed the hands, chest, and face, giving the illusion of strength when the body had none to spare. Families huddled around a single kettle, as if it were a hearth, watching steam fog the windows while wind forced its way through cracks in the walls. Even the thinnest tea tasted like hope in such moments, a fragile reminder that warmth still existed somewhere in their lives. Its role in survival was undeniable. Tea softened stale bread, thinned leftover broth, and calmed rumbling stomachs. It was not food, but it carried the emotional weight of food. It told the hungry that they were still capable of enduring one more day. This thin, reused tea offered warmth without nourishment, calming hunger just enough to keep families moving through long days. It revealed how survival relied on illusion when real food was out of reach. But an even stranger substitution awaited the poor, for many turned to weak beer and diluted alcohol when water itself became too dangerous to drink. Light beer and watered-down alcohol became a strange but necessary part of daily life for the Victorian poor, not because they sought pleasure or indulgence, but because water itself was too dangerous to drink. In crowded cities where sewage seeped into rivers and pumps drew from contaminated wells, clean water existed only in wealthy neighbourhoods. For everyone else, drinking from a public source meant risking cholera, typhoid, or debilitating stomach illness. Weak beer, despite its bitterness and thin body, offered a safer alternative. Boiled during brewing and mildly alcoholic, it killed enough bacteria to make it reliable when nothing else was. This made it not a luxury but a survival tool, one that even children sometimes relied on. Early mornings in working-class districts often began not with tea or bread, but with the metallic scent of cheap beer. Pubs and small shops opened at dawn to serve labourers preparing for long hours in factories, mines, or docks. These workers purchased mugs of beer so weak that they barely counted as alcohol, yet strong enough to dull hunger and warm the body. They drank quickly, often in silence, knowing it might be the only thing in their stomachs until evening. The beer coated the throat, settled heavily in the gut, and gave them the faint illusion of strength. For men expected to endure 10 or 12 hours of grueling labour, this illusion mattered. Inside homes, watered alcohol took on a different role. Mothers diluted the beer until it resembled cloudy water, then served it to children in tiny amounts. They knew it was not ideal. They knew children should not drink it. But they also knew the alternative, contaminated water, could mean death within days. In this impossible calculation, weak beer became the safer choice. Children sipped it reluctantly, grimacing at the unfamiliar bitterness. It provided warmth and a little heaviness in the stomach, just enough to quiet hunger until a real meal materialized, if one did at all. Beer also served as a form of cheap nourishment. Its calories, though limited, exceeded those of the thin broths many families relied on. A mug of weak beer could replace breakfast for an adult, or serve as the final meal of the day when cupboards were empty. Men finishing night shifts stopped at small taverns not to socialize, but to steady their bodies before collapsing into sleep. Women drank it to calm stomach cramps caused by days of undereating. Elderly neighbours took sips throughout the day, using it as a substitute for meals they could no longer afford. The brewing process of weak beer was a reflection of necessity rather than craftsmanship. Brewers used low-quality grains, often stretched with cheaper additives, producing a liquid more functional than flavourful. The alcohol content remained minimal, just enough to sanitize the drink. Barrels were transported through filthy streets, rolled through mud and refuse, then tapped by workers who wiped the spigots on their aprons. Cleanliness was not a guarantee, but it was far safer than unfiltered water. The beer's bitterness masked minor spoilage, making it difficult for drinkers to detect when it had turned. Still, they drank because they had no real alternative. Cheap spirits, heavily diluted, occasionally served the same purpose. Families mixed gin or rum with water that had been boiled, creating weak, sharp-tasting drinks used to soothe hunger or anxiety. These mixtures were risky. Alcohol masked rot, mold, or chemical contamination far too easily, yet desperation blurred caution. Some parents gave small amounts to babies to quiet their crying. Labourers drank them before difficult jobs to steady trembling hands or numb chronic pain. The line between necessity and harm became thin, almost invisible. Despite its importance, relying on beer and watered alcohol highlighted the depth of Victorian inequality. Wealthier homes boiled their water or purchased it from private sources, ensuring safety without altering their diets. The poor, meanwhile, drank beer not for pleasure, but for survival. Children grew up assuming that beer was normal, even natural, as a morning drink. Outsiders criticized them for immorality or lack of discipline, ignoring the reality that society had left them with only dangerous water or weak alcohol to choose from. The social consequences were complex. Workers often arrived at their jobs already warmed by weak beer, their stomachs full but their heads light. Employers viewed this as laziness or drunkenness, failing to acknowledge the root cause. Women struggling to stretch limited budgets faced judgment for serving diluted alcohol to children, even though doing so reduced the risk of disease. Entire neighbourhoods carried the smell of stale beer, a scent that distinguished poverty as clearly as any census record. Still, beer provided something crucial: predictability. It did not spoil quickly, it did not carry deadly pathogens, and it offered enough calories to keep a malnourished body moving. In a world where sickness lurked in every street corner, a mug of weak beer acted as a fragile shield. It gave strength when food was scarce, and warmth when winter cut through thin walls. It allowed survival, not health, not comfort, but survival. This thin, bitter beer gave the poor just enough strength to endure days shaped by hunger and cold, replacing dangerous water with a drink that numbed the body more than it nourished it. It revealed the small, heartbreaking compromises poverty demanded. But for those scraping by on almost nothing, even this meagre substitute felt like a luxury compared to the rarity of real eggs, a food so precious that one could be split between two people. Boiled eggs may seem simple today, but in Victorian poverty, they were rare treasures, foods that appeared only on special occasions or through the kindness of someone slightly better off. For families who lived day to day on bread crusts, thin soups, and whatever scraps they could salvage, the smooth weight of an egg in the hand felt almost unreal, as if it belonged to another world. Eggs promised real protein, real nourishment, real satisfaction, things the poor seldom experienced. Their rarity made them precious. A single egg could become the centerpiece of a meal shared between two people, each bite savored slowly, deliberately, with the awareness that such luxury would not return anytime soon. The poor seldom purchased eggs in markets. Prices fluctuated with the seasons, and even at their lowest, eggs cost more than most families could spare. Instead, eggs entered their lives through charity, festive gatherings, or the generosity of neighbours who had managed a slightly better week. Churches sometimes distributed eggs at Easter or during harvest celebrations. On such days, children carried them home like fragile ornaments, holding them tightly so they would not crack. Adults handled them with a reverence usually reserved for fine goods, understanding that each egg symbolized not just food, but a brief escape from scarcity. Boiling the egg became its own ritual. Families placed the precious item into a pot with care, watching closely as the water heated. The process felt almost ceremonial, a quiet pause in the chaos of survival. When the egg was finally removed, its shell steaming, everyone leaned in, drawn by the simple promise of nourishment. Mothers peeled it slowly, trying to keep every fragment of white intact. Children watched with wide eyes, waiting to see how the egg would be divided. It was not uncommon for an entire family of 4 or 5 to share one egg, each receiving only a small piece, yet grateful for the taste. The division of an egg was an act of both practicality and tenderness. Adults ensured children received the first bites, believing those small mouthfuls could make a meaningful difference in their growth. Often the egg was cut into thin slices, and each slice was passed around carefully so no crumb would be lost. Its flavour, rich compared to the bland foods that filled their days, lingered on the tongue long after it was eaten. Even a single bite felt restorative, warming the body in a way weak tea or stale bread never could. Because of its rarity, an egg often served as a reward. Parents promised children an egg on birthdays, holidays, or after acts of exceptional good behaviour. Teachers in charity schools sometimes gifted eggs to the most diligent students. These gestures carried emotional weight far beyond the cost of the food. They taught children to associate effort with reward, kindness with nourishment, and celebration with abundance. The memory of receiving an egg often stayed with children for years, standing out in contrast to the endless repetition of hunger. In crowded tenement buildings, the smell of boiling eggs drifted through thin walls, alerting neighbours that a household was experiencing a rare moment of fortune. This scent, faint, warm, unmistakable, stirred mixed emotions. Some felt joy for the family lucky enough to enjoy such a treat. Others felt a pang of envy, knowing they might not taste an egg for months. But the sense of community ran deep. Families often shared their fortune, offering a bite to an elderly neighbour or a sick child in another room. In this way, an egg became more than food. It became a symbol of care, connection, and compassion within poverty. The nutritional impact of eggs was significant. Children who managed to eat them occasionally showed better health and energy. Labourers appreciated the brief boost such food provided, especially during long workdays that required strength they did not have. Mothers, often malnourished themselves, sometimes went without their share so their children could benefit more fully. Sacrifice shaped every decision around eggs, reinforcing the quiet resilience that defined poor communities. Yet it was the emotional meaning of eggs that stood out most vividly. They represented possibility, the possibility of a day with fewer aches, a meal that felt complete, or a moment that resembled normalcy. They reminded families of what food was supposed to be: comforting, nourishing, satisfying. Their scarcity only deepened their significance, turning simple boiled eggs into symbols of everything poverty withheld. The contrast between classes became unmistakable. Wealthy households consumed eggs daily, fried, poached, baked into pastries, or whipped into custards. Their abundance stood in painful opposition to the rationed bites shared by the poor. To the wealthy, eggs were ordinary. To the poor, they were extraordinary. Still, within the limits of hardship, eggs brought joy. The gleam of a peeled egg on a chipped plate, the silence as a family shared it, the warmth it spread through hungry bodies. These small moments provided rare relief from deprivation. They were reminders that even in the harshest conditions, small pleasures could survive. This single boiled egg, divided with such care, offered the poor a moment of nourishment and dignity, standing out sharply against the monotony of their daily hunger. It revealed how even the smallest luxury could transform a meal into a memory. Yet an even bleaker reality awaited many. For those imprisoned by poverty found themselves fed on the thinnest gruel and driest bread, barely enough to keep them alive. Prison diets in Victorian times revealed one of the starkest truths about how society valued human life. For those confined within stone walls and iron bars, food existed only as a means of preventing death, never as a source of comfort or nourishment. Every meal was stripped down to the barest essentials: thin gruel that barely clung to the spoon, dry bread so hard it strained the jaw, and water that tasted of metal and damp stone. Protein was almost absent. Meat appeared only under the bleakest circumstances, when a prisoner was visibly wasting away, on the edge of collapse. Even then it came not as generosity, but as maintenance, a calculated attempt to keep bodies functioning just enough to serve their sentences. Each morning, prisoners were handed bowls of gruel so watery that it reflected the dim light from the small, barred windows. The mixture consisted of oats boiled in large vats, stretched with as much water as could be added without turning it into mere broth. Served lukewarm, it coated the tongue with a chalky film that lingered long after the bowl was emptied. Yet hunger made it necessary. Prisoners ate quickly, aware that failing to finish might result in hours of work with nothing else to sustain them. The gruel delivered calories but not strength. It fueled survival, not labour. Bread formed the second half of most meals, though calling it bread felt generous. These loaves, baked in large batches, were dense, dry, and nearly flavourless. They crumbled into powdery fragments when broken, each bite demanding effort. Some prisoners soaked the bread in their gruel to soften it, creating a tasteless paste that slid down the throat more easily. Others gnawed it slowly, trying to make the portion last. The dryness scraped the mouth and the back of the throat, but the alternative, swallowing it whole, was nearly impossible. Still, prisoners carried their rations carefully, treating them like an anchor in a day otherwise defined by monotony and hardship. Protein deficiencies became visible within weeks. Prisoners' cheeks hollowed, their muscles weakened, and their joints ached from the constant strain of physical labour paired with inadequate nourishment. Tasks like breaking stones, turning cranks, or pulling carts became increasingly difficult. Supervisors interpreted this weakness as laziness, adding punishment rather than rest. The diet, intentionally sparse, ensured obedience by exhaustion. A body too hungry to resist was easier to control. Meat was almost mythical within prison walls. Stories spread among inmates about someone receiving a piece of boiled beef or a scrap of salted pork, though such portions were often no larger than a few bites. These rare servings were not rewards but warnings. They appeared only when a prisoner's deterioration threatened the institution itself. When someone grew too gaunt, too faint, too close to death, officials intervened, not out of concern, but out of the fear that a dying prisoner represented failure. The meat itself, often stringy or old, provided minimal improvement, but for prisoners who had spent months eating only starch and water, even a few fibres of muscle felt like a miracle. Water accompanied every meal, though it was more a necessity than a comfort. Stored in large barrels, it absorbed the smells of the prison: damp straw, metal and stone. It was cold in winter, tepid in summer, always leaving a faint aftertaste. Still, prisoners drank it because their bodies demanded it. Combined with the heavy starch from bread and gruel, water created a false sense of fullness that kept prisoners moving through their routines. But fullness was not nourishment. Weakness spread quietly through their bodies, revealing itself in trembling hands, slow footsteps, and shallow breaths. The psychological effects of the prison diet were perhaps even more severe than the physical ones. Food became a measurement of worth. Each ration reinforced the idea that prisoners deserved only the bare minimum required for life. Meals were served quickly, without ceremony, without acknowledgement of individuality. Eating felt less like sustaining oneself and more like conforming to the system's definition of survival. Hope, like nourishment, arrived in small, fleeting portions. Prisoners often fantasized about food. Conversations in cells drifted toward memories of meals before imprisonment: bread with butter, meat pies, thick soups, roasted potatoes. These memories became both torment and motivation. Some prisoners traded portions when they could, though most had nothing to spare. A few hoarded crumbs for nighttime hunger, hiding them in small cloth bundles. Others ate their rations the moment they received them, unable to endure waiting. Time itself seemed structured around meals, even though the meals offered little to anticipate. The contrast between prison food and the diets of even the poorest free citizens was stark. Outside, people scavenged, shared leftovers, or stretched scraps into meals, but at least they retained some agency. Prisoners, stripped of choice, consumed the same monotonous rations day after day. Their bodies adapted, though poorly, to the cycle of starch and water. Many left prison thinner, weaker, and permanently affected by long-term malnutrition. And yet, despite the cruelty embedded in this sparse diet, prisoners survived. They endured the grinding hunger, the endless fatigue, the slow erosion of strength. Their ability to adapt to such deprivation revealed not resilience, but the brutal efficiency of the system that fed them just enough to live, but never enough to thrive. This thin gruel and brittle bread kept prisoners alive while draining their strength, reducing survival to a mechanical process defined by hunger and exhaustion. It showed how confinement relied on food that sustained bodies but starved spirits. A harsher truth waited outside prison walls, for orphan children living in charity institutions faced diets just as bleak, leaving them malnourished even as they were supposedly being cared for. Orphans in Victorian institutions lived according to a rigid schedule that dictated every part of their existence, and nowhere was this harsh structure felt more deeply than at mealtimes. Their food arrived in fixed portions, measured not with care but with calculation, just enough to keep them alive, never enough to let them grow strong. Breakfast brought thin gruel, lunch offered boiled vegetables stripped of flavour and nutrients, and dinner consisted of dry bread that crumbled like dust between their fingers. Day after day, year after year, these children consumed meals that filled their stomachs but hollowed their bodies, creating a generation marked by stunted growth and chronic weakness. The morning gruel set the tone for the entire day. Prepared in massive iron pots, it was little more than oats stretched with water until it formed a grey, watery liquid. The children lined up with tin bowls that clanged softly in the cold air, waiting for the ladle to drop a thin stream into each one. The gruel's warmth vanished within seconds, leaving behind a bland, sticky residue that clung to their tongues. Still, the orphans ate every drop, scraping the sides of their bowls with spoons worn smooth by years of use. Hunger taught them efficiency. There was no room for waste. By midday, the children gathered again, this time for boiled vegetables. These were not fresh or vibrant, but wilted, overcooked, and often on the verge of spoilage. Carrots lost their colour, cabbage leaves turned mushy, and potatoes dissolved into lumps that tasted of nothing. The vegetables floated in cloudy water that carried the faint scent of earth and iron. Yet this meal, though flavourless, provided the closest thing to substance the children received. They chewed slowly, not because they enjoyed it, but because finishing too quickly left them hungrier than before. The meal lasted only minutes, but its effects lingered all afternoon, a heaviness without real nourishment. Dinner offered the bleakest meal of all. Each child received a piece of dry bread, sometimes softened with steam, more often stiff enough to scrape the inside of their mouths. The bread lacked the minerals, fats, and grains needed to support growing bodies. It filled the stomach, but offered nothing else. Children sometimes dipped the bread into water to soften it, though the water itself tasted metallic and stale. For many, this evening ration became the hardest moment of the day, not because of hunger alone, but because dinner signalled that no more food would come until dawn. The knowledge of a long night ahead made each bite feel both precious and insufficient. The absence of fruit, meat, or dairy shaped the bodies of these orphans with quiet brutality. Their limbs grew thin, their ribs visible beneath their clothes, their faces pale and hollow. Malnutrition left them vulnerable to illness. Colds turned into fevers, minor infections lingered for weeks, and any injury healed slowly. Teachers and overseers interpreted their weakness as laziness, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that the children lacked the caloric strength to meet the demands placed upon them. The institutions claimed to provide shelter and care, yet failed to offer the most basic form of protection: adequate food. Milk, a crucial source of vitamins and fat, was almost absent from their diet. Meat appeared so rarely that some children reached adolescence without ever tasting it. Fruit was considered unnecessary, too expensive, and too delicate to distribute among hundreds of hungry hands. The result was a generation of fragile bodies, plagued by scurvy, rickets, weak bones, and chronic fatigue. These conditions were rarely recognized as medical issues. Instead, the children were blamed for their own frailty, punished for their inability to keep pace with the demands of the institution. Within the dormitories, children whispered about food. They spoke of memories from early childhood, a piece of fruit given by a parent, a bowl of soup shared with siblings, and sweet tasted once and never again. These memories became emotional anchors, reminders of lives that had been taken from them. Some children saved tiny crumbs of bread to eat at night, stretching the illusion of fullness for as long as they could. Others traded pieces of their ration for favours or companionship, creating small economies built on hunger. Food shaped their relationships, their fears, and their hopes. The psychological toll of this rigid diet was immense. Mealtimes were not moments of comfort, but reminders of scarcity. The institutional dining halls echoed with the clatter of bowls and the scraping of spoons, but not with conversation or laughter. Eating became mechanical, a chore performed out of necessity. The children learned not to expect pleasure from food, only survival. Their understanding of nourishment narrowed to the simplest terms: something to keep the body standing, something to quiet the gnawing emptiness until tomorrow. Yet the children adapted, as children often do. They found ways to endure the monotony, sharing strategies to make their rations last longer or feel more filling. They joked about the thinness of the gruel, the sadness of the vegetables, the dryness of the bread, humour as a shield against despair. But adaptation did not erase the damage. It only disguised it. The institutions believed their feeding system was adequate. After all, the children were alive, and alive was all that mattered. Health, growth, strength, happiness. These were luxuries reserved for children born into better circumstances. Orphans, in the eyes of the system, required only the minimum. Their small bodies, weakened and underfed, became silent testimonies to how little society expected them to become. These rigid, nutrient-poor meals kept orphaned children alive, while ensuring they grew frail, shaping their bodies and futures through deprivation rather than care. It revealed how institutions valued survival over well-being. Moving beyond these walls, the struggle for food took on a different form among factory workers, who depended on greasy sandwiches of fat or pickles to sustain themselves during relentless hours of labour. Factory workers in Victorian cities lived on meals designed for speed rather than nourishment, food that could be eaten standing up, with greasy fingers, in the narrow window between one exhausting task and the next. Their days were carved into rigid schedules controlled by the relentless rhythm of machines, leaving little time for comfort or proper meals. To survive these long hours, workers relied on the simplest, cheapest handheld food they could manage: slabs of stale bread stuffed with rendered fat or thin slices of pickles. These makeshift sandwiches were not eaten for pleasure. They were tools, fuel consumed quickly, thoughtlessly, because there was no time for anything else. Before dawn, workers walked through foggy streets carrying their meals wrapped in paper scraps or old cloth. Inside those bundles lay the same predictable items day after day: rendered fat, saved from lard or leftover drippings, hardened into a waxy sheet that could be sliced and pressed between bread. When melted by the warmth of the hands or the factory floor, it soaked through the crust, leaving a greasy stain that workers licked clean rather than waste. On other days, pickles replaced fat, harsh, acidic slices that jolted the senses but offered almost no calories. Both versions lacked vegetables, protein, or vitamins. They provided only a brief fullness in the stomach, nothing more. Meals took no more than 5 minutes, often less. Workers staggered outside during short breaks, shielding their food from soot and ash drifting through the factory yard. They leaned against walls or wooden crates, chewing rapidly, swallowing without tasting, already feeling the pressure to return inside. Many did not even stop working fully. They ate while continuing to operate machinery, wiping their hands on aprons before taking another bite. Eating became a mechanical motion, folded seamlessly into labour. The body had to keep moving, and there was no luxury of savouring. The smell of these meals lingered on the factory floor. Warm lard melted under the heat of machines, filling the air with a faint, greasy scent that clung to clothes, hair, and skin. Pickles added sharp vinegar notes that mixed strangely with coal smoke. Workers carried these smells home each night, embedded in the fibres of their clothing. Even after washing, when washing was possible, the odours never fully disappeared. Food became part of their identity as much as their labour did, marking them as members of the working poor. Children who worked in factories ate the same meals. They carried small sandwiches with them, often prepared by siblings or parents before sunrise. Their portion was smaller, their hunger greater. Some took only a few bites before returning to tasks that required constant focus and physical strain. Others saved half for the end of the day, rationing their meagre food carefully. These children grew thin, their bodies stretched by labour and starved by necessity. The sandwiches kept them upright, but not well. The lack of variety in these meals took a toll on the body. Workers suffered from chronic fatigue, dizziness, and digestive discomfort. Their diets lacked iron, vitamins, and protein. Teeth weakened from acidity and poor hygiene. Skin grew pale and dry. Muscles remained underdeveloped despite long hours of physical exertion. The body simply did not receive what it needed to rebuild itself each night. Instead, workers awoke each morning slightly weaker, sustained only by routine and sheer will. Despite these hardships, the sandwiches offered something important: predictability. Workers knew exactly what they could afford. Fat was cheap, pickles even cheaper. Fresh meat was a luxury rarely seen, and vegetables spoiled too quickly to store or carry. Bread, though often stale, formed the foundation of their meals. In a world governed by strict rules and unstable wages, having even one reliable form of food provided a small measure of security. The emotional weight of these meals was heavy. Workers dreamed of warm stews, roasted meats, and bread soft enough to tear apart easily. But such meals belonged to Sundays, holidays, or fantasies. Eating became a burden, another reminder of the limits imposed by poverty. Moments that should have brought relief instead reinforced the constant struggle. Even so, they never complained openly. Complaining took time, and time was something the factory never granted. Lunch breaks were brief flashes of human connection. Workers shared bites of their food, discussed rumours of wage changes, or exchanged glances filled with quiet understanding. The sandwiches, humble and inadequate, became part of the collective rhythm of factory life. They symbolised endurance, resilience, and the capacity to keep moving despite exhaustion. These meals also highlighted the cruelty of industrial work. Machines demanded constant attention, and supervisors enforced punctuality with strict discipline. Workers often returned to their stations with crumbs still on their shirts, grease on their fingers, and hunger still gnawing at their stomachs. Their bodies pushed forward because stopping was not an option. Every bite taken quickly allowed them to continue, one more hour, one more shift, one more week. Despite everything, these sandwiches sustained millions. They helped workers survive the harshest conditions, providing just enough calories to endure. But they also revealed how deeply industrial society ignored the basic needs of those who kept it running. Food, like wages, came in minimal amounts, given only to keep the system functioning. These greasy or sour sandwiches kept factory workers upright, but never nourished them, turning food into a rushed necessity rather than a source of strength. They exposed how labour demanded everything while giving almost nothing in return. Beyond the factory walls, another group relied on charity alone, lining up at churches for thin soups and stale bread just to make it through the week. Elderly people in Victorian cities often survived on meals offered by churches, thin vegetable soups and stale bread handed out a few days each week to those considered too weak or too poor to fend for themselves. These meals, humble and inconsistent, became the fragile thread that kept many older men and women alive. For those whose bodies could no longer endure factory work or street labour, charity represented the final safety net. Yet even this lifeline demanded patience, endurance, and the willingness to wait in long lines before dawn, hoping the pot would not empty before their turn. Each distribution day began in darkness. Elderly residents, wrapped in worn shawls and patched coats, shuffled through the cold streets toward the church steps. Their movements were slow, shaped by years of hardship and the aches of age. Some carried small bowls or tins, others brought whatever container they owned, no matter how dented or chipped. They lined up silently, leaning on canes, walls, or one another for support. Breath fogged in the morning air as they waited, sometimes for hours, long before the church doors opened. Hunger made them early. Fear of scarcity kept them still. Inside the church kitchens, volunteers prepared large pots of soup, though calling it soup felt almost generous. The broth was thin and translucent, often made from vegetable scraps salvaged from markets. Wilted greens, carrot tops, potato peels, onion skins. These scraps released little flavour and even less nutrition, but they created warmth, and warmth mattered. The smell drifted through the halls, earthy and faint, hinting at comfort without promising it. Alongside the soup came baskets of bread, collected from nearby bakeries, bread that had gone stale or hardened overnight. The church deemed it still edible, though barely. When the doors finally opened, the line moved slowly. Each person stepped forward carefully, gripping their bowls as if they might disappear. Volunteers ladled out 1 scoop of soup per person, no more. Some scoops contained bits of vegetables, others were nearly all broth. Afterward came a single piece of stale bread, sometimes so firm it required soaking before it could be eaten. Still, the elderly received these portions with gratitude. They murmured thanks, bowed their heads, and stepped aside to let the next person through. Many sat on nearby steps or curbs to eat immediately. Their hands trembled slightly as they lifted the bowls, blowing gently on the hot liquid. The soup warmed their chests and eased the stiffness of their limbs, even if only briefly. The bread softened slowly, absorbing the broth, transforming into something easier to chew. Around them, the city awakened, carts rattling over cobblestones, vendors opening stalls, but for a few minutes, the elderly could focus solely on the act of eating. It was perhaps the quietest moment of their entire week. However, the meals came with limitations. Churches did not have endless supplies, and their charity could not extend every day. Most served only 2 or 3 times weekly. On the days without distribution, the elderly endured hunger through whatever means they could manage: weak tea, leftover scraps, or nothing at all. Some tried to stretch the soup by taking small sips, saving part of the bread for later. Others, without the strength for such restraint, finished everything quickly, knowing hunger would return long before the next offering. The predictability of the distribution schedule brought both comfort and anxiety. Elderly individuals marked the charity days on their calendars or etched them into memory, structuring their entire week around these meals. Missing a distribution due to illness, bad weather, or slow walking meant going hungry. This fear pushed them to brave rain, snow, or biting wind. Church steps became gathering places where frailty met determination, where age met survival, where community formed out of necessity. These meals also revealed the emotional weight of poverty. Many elderly people had once worked long, grueling jobs. They had contributed to factories, docks, shops, and households, only to grow old without pensions or support. Now they stood in charity lines, humbled by circumstances beyond their control. Some felt shame, glancing away when others passed by. Others felt resignation. In Victorian society, growing old without money meant becoming invisible, except on the days when the church doors opened and hunger forced them into public view. Yet there was a quiet dignity in how they carried themselves. They thanked volunteers sincerely, shared their bread with those even weaker, and looked after neighbours who struggled to stand. Some helped steady others in the line. Others offered to carry an extra bowl for a sick friend at home. Charity did not erase hardship, but it did create small acts of kindness that softened the sharp edges of suffering. Inside their cramped rooms, these elderly individuals saved their bread crusts on shelves or wrapped them in cloth for another day. The soup, once eaten, warmed their bodies long enough to get them through the afternoon, but the nourishment was never enough. Malnutrition carved deep lines into their faces, weakened their bones, and slowed their movements. Still, they returned, week after week, drawn by hope. Hope for warmth, for food, for survival. These thin soups and stale bread kept the elderly alive just long enough to endure another cycle of hardship, revealing how charity offered comfort without ever addressing the roots of their hunger. It exposed how survival often depended on patience, luck, and the willingness to stand in line before dawn. Moving into a different corner of Victorian life, the contrast became even sharper in wealthy homes where imported canned foods marked a level of luxury unimaginable to the poor. Canned foods in Victorian times carried an aura that set them apart from the meals known to ordinary families, creating a quiet divide that could be seen on the tables of wealthy homes. The cans arrived sealed, polished, and stamped with names of distant regions, their surfaces promising a level of safety and refinement unavailable to most people. Inside was salted beef, tender salmon, and preserved fruits that retained a colour and softness foreign to the rough ingredients of working-class kitchens. Opening a can became a gesture of status, a way to show that the household had access not only to food, but to the emerging convenience that Victorians associated with progress. The idea that food could be eaten without washing, peeling, cutting, or worrying about spoilage felt astonishing to those who could afford it, and their admiration for these imported goods shaped an entirely new definition of modern dining. The dining rooms where canned foods were served were bright and orderly, lit by lamps that cast a steady glow across polished wood and neat arrangements of utensils. Wealthy families expected meals to appear with grace, and servants were trained to present canned dishes as if they were rare delicacies. When the salted beef slid out in clean slices, or the salmon settled neatly onto a plate, the presentation reinforced the notion that this type of food belonged to a world untouched by the grime and unpredictability of everyday life. Even the juices within the cans seemed to embody this difference, remaining clear and controlled rather than clouded with dust or the lingering grit of market stalls. For those who purchased these imported items, eating became an experience wrapped in the assurances of industry and empire. The labels praised freshness and purity, offering comfort to families who feared the illnesses so common in the city. Consuming canned goods was a way to feel protected, a quiet attempt to place distance between oneself and the risks that filled the streets. Wealthier households understood that the convenience was not simply about effort, but about safety, and the sealed lids represented a barrier between them and the contamination that loomed over open markets. A can could be trusted in a way that a butcher's stall or fishmonger's counter could not. In parlours and kitchens alike, the novelty of opening a can often became a small ceremony, performed with a sense of pride. The metal hissed as it yielded, releasing aromas that carried none of the sourness or unpredictability found in cheaper foods. Even the sound of the opener scraping against the lid was associated with advancement, a notable shift toward a future shaped by machines. Victorian families who could afford these items believed that they were participating in the next stage of domestic life, one where science promised consistent nourishment regardless of season or distance. These canned foods did more than nourish bodies, they produced a subtle emotional divide between classes. The poor, who struggled with coarse bread and thin soup, could only imagine what it must feel like to eat peaches that remained soft through the winter, or beef that tasted fresh despite being transported across continents. In contrast, wealthy families considered canned goods a natural part of their routines, rarely thinking of how extraordinary such convenience would appear to those living only a few streets away. This quiet separation marked a growing awareness that food was no longer merely a resource, but a marker of identity and privilege. Even the servants who prepared and heated the canned meals rarely tasted them, keeping their distance in accordance with the unspoken rules of class. It is striking how these carefully sealed tins contrast with the harsh conditions endured by the working poor. While ordinary families spent evenings chewing on stale bread or boiled potatoes, the wealthy could sample fruits from colonies they would never visit. The empire made such luxuries possible, transporting goods across oceans in quantities unimaginable a generation earlier. Each can represent a network of ships, merchants and colonies, woven together into a system built to satisfy the desires of those at the top. Eating from a can became a reminder of global power, reinforcing the idea that the world existed to supply their tables. Inside some homes, Collections of empty cans even became decorative objects, saved and displayed as evidence of participation in this modern lifestyle. These metallic remnants reflected the pride that homeowners felt in their ability to purchase goods associated with innovation and progress. The contrast with the fragile clay pots or reused jars of poorer neighbourhoods could not have been clearer. To the wealthy, the future of food looked bright, sealed, and reliable, protected from the decay that shaped the diets of the majority. As the popularity of canned foods grew, newspapers praised their benefits, pointing to reduced waste and increased safety. Writers described them as signs of a civilized household, framing them as a natural part of maintaining order and refinement. Their glowing reports further distanced the rich from the everyday realities of their neighbours, who continued to rely on foods that spoiled quickly or offered limited nourishment. In this sense, the growth of canned goods influenced not only nutrition but perception, shaping the way society viewed progress and wealth. The rise of imported canned foods illustrated more than culinary change. It revealed how deeply food signalled belonging, aspiration, and the quiet borders that separated households. While the wealthy felt protected by the sealed tins on their shelves, the poor faced a different struggle, one defined by scarcity and the constant search for affordable calories. The contrast between these experiences made Victorian dining an unspoken map of inequality, etched into every meal served across the city. These imported tins, polished and neatly stacked, revealed how wealth could purchase both safety and convenience in a world where most meals were born from scarcity. They showed how food became a marker of class, rather than simple nourishment. The divide grew even clearer when looking at the poor, who relied on backyard pigs and consumed every part of the animal simply to survive. In the crowded backyards of Victorian workers' neighbourhoods, the presence of a pig was often the only sign that a family had any hope of eating meat at all. Unlike beef, lamb, or poultry, which were sold at prices impossible for labourers to afford, pigs were animals that even the poorest could keep in makeshift pens behind their small homes. They grew on kitchen scraps, spoiled vegetables, and any leftover starches a family could not finish. A pig was not merely livestock but a living savings account, a guarantee that at least once in the year the household would taste something richer than bread or boiled grains. Its presence offered psychological comfort during long months of hunger, though the true relief only came at slaughter time. When that day arrived, it was not a celebration but a grim necessity. Meat was so rare in the diets of the poor that every part of the pig had to be used. Nothing could be wasted. Families boiled the bones until they lost all strength, scraped the fat from the underside of the skin, and collected every ounce of lard. Ears, tongue, liver, stomach, feet, and even the blood became ingredients in the week's meals. The meat itself was rationed so carefully that a single shoulder could be stretched across days if chopped into soups or stews. Victorian cookbooks for the poor were filled with instructions for turning scraps into sustenance, boiling until soft, frying until edible, seasoning heavily to hide the smell of aging fat. It was survival cuisine, shaped by necessity rather than taste. Lard, in particular, became the backbone of working-class diets. It was melted, strained through cloth, and stored in jars near the hearth. When vegetables were available, they were fried in lard. When bread grew too stale to chew, it was softened in lard. Puddings made from flour and lard formed heavy, filling meals that kept hunger at bay even when no true protein remained. The presence of lard was so vital that families measured their well-being not by how much money they had, but by how much fat sat in the cooking pot. It powered bodies through grueling shifts in factories, mines and workshops, where fainting from hunger was a daily risk. For children, the pig represented a strange mixture of comfort and dread. They fed it scraps, watched it grow, and sometimes even gave it names. But they also understood that affection had limits. When the air turned cold and the family's food stores dwindled, the animal's fate was sealed. It was common for neighbours to help each other during the butchering, not out of generosity, but out of shared hardship. In exchange for assistance, they received small cuts, often pieces the primary family did not want or could not store. This tradition kept entire communities tethered together by necessity. Hunger, more than anything, created cooperation. The processing of a pig was an unsanitary affair by modern standards. It took place outdoors, on rough wooden tables that were never fully cleaned. Knives were sharpened on stones and rinsed in buckets of cold, murky water. Flies gathered quickly, attracted to the warmth and smell of fresh meat. Families worked fast to salt, smoke, or boil the parts before they spoiled. Spoilage was a constant threat, especially in crowded cities where cool storage was impossible. Many poor households relied on rapid consumption simply because they had no choice. Despite these risks, pork remained the most reliable source of protein available to the working class. Butchers offered cheap cuts, fatty trimmings, bits of cartilage, or organs that wealthier customers refused. These leftovers, collectively known as offal, were the building blocks of soups and pies that filled stomachs without offering much nutritional value. It was not unusual for these scraps to be days old, tinged with sourness, and handled with bare hands in filthy shop stalls. Yet people bought them eagerly, because the alternative was another meal of bread and weak tea. The pig's value extended even further. Its bones could be boiled into broth, its skin fried into cracklings, its fat turned into candles or soap, and its bladder used as a storage pouch. Every part served a purpose, ensuring that the family's investment never went to waste. In a society where hunger was constant, efficiency became a survival skill. Victorian moralists often romanticized this frugality as a virtue of the poor, ignoring the painful truth that people economized only because they lacked all other options. The contrast between the pig-dependent poor and the meat-abundant wealthy was startling. In affluent neighborhoods, butcher windows displayed large cuts of beef, lamb roasts, and neatly trimmed sausages. These were luxuries the poor rarely even smelled. For them, pork was not an indulgence, but a reminder of the precarious line between survival and starvation. A family without a pig was a family living on borrowed time. Thinking back on these scenes, it becomes clear that the pig symbolized both resilience and desperation. Its presence in Victorian backyards reflects a world where food was unevenly distributed, and survival relied on creativity, endurance, and the willingness to consume whatever the body could tolerate. The pig provided nourishment, but it also revealed just how limited the diets of the working class truly were. The constant search for calories shaped their lives, their health, and their understanding of what it meant to endure poverty. This relentless dependence on a single animal showed how few choices the poor truly had, reducing diet to a matter of survival rather than preference. It underscored how hunger shaped routines, decisions, and even identity in neighborhoods where a pig meant security. Looking further into Victorian streets, the struggle only became harsher when children were forced to earn their own food money by selling matches or newspapers in a world that barely noticed their hunger. In the early mornings of Victorian cities, before factory whistles sounded and before shopkeepers lifted their shutters, children were already on the streets, clutching bundles of newspapers or small boxes of matches. They walked quickly, their thin boots scraping against the cobblestones, their breath visible in the cold air. These children were among the poorest in the social hierarchy, surviving day by day on a handful of coins they earned from selling to strangers rushing past them. Their lives were shaped not by school lessons or play, but by the simple arithmetic of survival. Earn a few pennies, buy a piece of bread or a hot potato, and hope it would be enough to keep hunger and illness at bay. The work was relentless. Selling newspapers required a loud voice, nimble movements, and the courage to approach adults who often ignored them. Selling matches was even worse, for the profit margin was tiny, and many customers bought only out of pity. These children were invisible to society, until a moment of sympathy or annoyance brought them briefly into focus. They were too young to be labourers, and too poor to be students. Their presence on the streets was a symptom of a deeper imbalance, one where the poorest families relied on every pair of hands, even the smallest, to contribute to the household's survival. Food was never guaranteed. A good day of selling meant a warm potato purchased from a street vendor, steam rising from its cracked skin. Some children held these potatoes against their chests before eating them, savouring both the warmth and the anticipation. On worse days, they bought the cheapest bread available, often stale, hard, and barely enough to quiet a growling stomach. A few relied on penny pies, tiny pastries stuffed with scraps of meat or vegetables of questionable origin. These pies were notorious for their unpredictable contents, but hunger left no room for caution. The exhaustion was constant. Most of the children were underfed, their limbs thin and their faces pale. Long hours outdoors in freezing weather weakened them further, leaving them vulnerable to coughs, infections, and fevers. Some collapsed on the streets, overwhelmed by fatigue or hunger. Others simply disappeared from their usual corners, their absence noted briefly by competing vendors and then forgotten. Victorian society treated these losses as inevitable, the natural result of poverty rather than a failure of compassion. Despite the harshness, the streets formed their own kind of community. Newspaper boys shared tips about the best-selling spots, while match girls warned each other about unfriendly customers or patrolling officers. A child might save another a small portion of bread, or help chase away older boys who tried to steal their meagre earnings. Such gestures were rare but meaningful, reminders that even within the grinding machinery of poverty, moments of humanity could still surface. Still, the dangers far outweighed the comforts. Street vendors were often targets for theft, not because they carried valuable goods, but because every penny counted. Older boys or desperate adults sometimes snatched their coins or food, leaving them to start the day's work again with nothing. The children had no protection, no legal guardians watching over their labour, and no recourse when mistreated. Even the charities that claimed to help the poor focused more on moral instruction than actual nourishment, offering prayers instead of bread. By late afternoon, the children felt the full weight of hunger. Some of them walked to the quayside where fishermen sold leftovers, fish heads, bones, and small trimmings they could not sell to wealthier customers. These scraps were cheap, sometimes only a single coin. Others waited near the bakery's back doors, in hopes that a worker might toss out a few unsold rolls. These moments of luck sustained them, though never fully. In winter, the struggle intensified. Cold winds cut through thin clothing, numbing fingers, and making it difficult to hold papers or strike a match. Vendors huddled near steam vents or bakery windows just to feel a moment of warmth. For many, illness was a constant companion. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, and fevers spread rapidly among children living in overcrowded housing and eating only the barest of meals. Doctors were unavailable, and medicine was unaffordable. Survival depended entirely on resilience and chance. What makes their situation even more tragic is how normal it seemed to the Victorians themselves. Adults passed these children daily without questioning why they were alone on the streets or how they sustained themselves. Their labour was absorbed into the rhythm of the city, seen as a natural part of urban life. Only when a child died publicly, collapsing on the pavement or freezing during the night, did the newspapers take notice. And even then, the reports framed the deaths as unfortunate but expected. Looking back, it is difficult not to feel unsettled by the contrast between the children's desperate struggle and the indifference surrounding them. Their pennies determined whether they would eat that day, whether their bodies had enough strength to endure another morning's work. A simple hot potato could mean the difference between fainting on the street and finishing a shift. In a society obsessed with progress and morality, these young vendors were reminders of how uneven the promise of prosperity truly was. These exhausted children, clutching potatoes or stale bread, reveal how hunger shaped every hour of their lives and left little room for anything resembling childhood. Their survival depended on coins small enough to slip through the cracks of society's conscience. The cruelty of their world becomes even more stark when night fell, and countless homeless people faced the cold with nothing but empty stomachs and the hope of finding a crumb to endure the winter darkness. Winter in Victorian cities was more than a season. It was a test of endurance that many homeless people did not survive. As temperatures dropped and frost spread across rooftops and cobblestones, those without shelter faced nights that felt endless, stretched thin between hunger and cold. Their days were spent wandering the streets in search of scraps, while their nights were battles against freezing wind and an emptiness in the stomach that grew sharper with every passing hour. Food was often unattainable, and hunger became a constant companion that followed them through alleyways, workhouses, and cramped doorways where they tried to sleep. The body weakened quickly under such strain, and many simply collapsed, too exhausted to continue the struggle. The homeless had few options for nourishment. Water was cold and often dirty, yet they drank it anyway, desperate to fill their stomachs with anything that offered even temporary relief from hunger pains. Others relied on the cheapest ale available, thin, weak, and barely alcoholic, but warm enough to give a momentary illusion of comfort. This ale functioned almost as a substitute for food, calming their shivering bodies and making the cold nights slightly more bearable. But the relief never lasted. The hunger always returned, stronger than before, reminding them that survival was not guaranteed. During daylight hours, they gravitated toward markets and bakeries, hoping for discarded crusts or scraps that shopkeepers tossed aside at closing time. They waited patiently, eyes fixed on the hands of workers sweeping crumbs from tables. The competition for these leftovers was intense. Dozens of starving people hovered around the same spots, each hoping to catch a small piece of bread before others grabbed it. If kindness appeared, it was fleeting, perhaps a passerby dropping a broken biscuit, or an old woman offering half a roll she no longer wanted. Such gestures were cherished, not for their nutritional value, but for the rare acknowledgement that the homeless was still human. As evening settled in, the cold deepened. Fog rolled across the streets, settling over the bodies huddled under staircases and beside stone walls. Without blankets or warm clothing, many wrapped themselves in newspapers or thin coats, patched repeatedly until the fabric no longer held heat. They pressed their bodies against one another for warmth, forming clusters in narrow alleys where the wind could not fully reach them. The nights were filled with the sounds of coughing, chattering teeth, and the restless shifting of those unable to find a comfortable position on the frozen ground. The fear of winter was not exaggerated. It was known throughout working-class districts as the starvation season, a time when charity became stretched thin and food distribution could not keep pace with growing needs. Workhouses offered limited assistance, but their reputation for harsh discipline and humiliation made many avoid them unless they were utterly desperate. Even when admitted, the meals provided were meagre, a bowl of watery gruel, a piece of dry bread, and nothing more. For people who entered already starving, this was rarely enough to restore their strength. Deaths rose sharply during the coldest months. Some were found frozen in alleyways, their bodies curled inward as if attempting to shield themselves from the final chill. Others succumbed quietly in doorways of churches or behind market stalls. These tragedies were met with public indifference. Newspaper reports described them in brief, detached tones, noting the deceased as one of the city's vagrants, as if their suffering was an expected part of urban life. No investigation followed, no reforms were demanded. The city simply absorbed their bodies into its statistics. For those who survived, winter left lasting marks. Their fingers stiffened from frostbite, their joints ached from sleeping on stone, and their skin grew pale and thin from malnutrition. Many carried these injuries into spring and summer, their bodies never fully recovering before the next winter arrived. Hunger shaped their movements and thoughts, making every decision revolve around the food search. Even small crumbs took on enormous significance in a world where survival depended on them. The emotional toll was just as severe. Nights stretched into long hours of reflection, where the homeless grappled with the fear of dying unseen, unremembered, and unmissed. They watched families hurrying home to warm meals and fires, knowing those comforts were entirely out of reach. Each winter stripped them of a little more hope, replacing it with resignation. Poverty was not just a lack of resources, it was a slow erosion of the spirit. Looking at these lives now, it becomes clear that Victorian society constructed its own hierarchy of suffering. The wealthy dined on imported meats and canned delicacies. The workers scraped together meals from whatever they could afford, and the homeless balanced on the thin line between life and death. Their hunger was not a personal failure, but a direct consequence of a system that treated survival as a privilege rather than a right. Winter only exposed this truth more violently. These starving figures, huddled in doorways and alley shadows, revealed how hunger dictated every decision and drained what little strength they had left. Their suffering exposed the society that handed out compassion in fragments, too small to keep anyone alive. Turning toward moments of rare abundance, festival days stand out as the only times when the poor tasted real meat and warmth, creating a stark contrast that makes their brief relief all the more haunting. Celebration days in Victorian Britain carried a weight far greater than joy or festivity. For the poor, a festival was not simply a holiday, but a brief interruption in the long rhythm of hunger that dominated the rest of the year. While wealthier families decorated their homes, exchanged gifts, and filled tables with meats and sweets, the lower classes gathered near churches, mission houses, and charity halls where, perhaps only once every 12 months, they could expect a truly filling meal. These gatherings, often tied to religious holidays or winter relief efforts, were moments that breathed life back into bodies thinned by relentless scarcity. A bowl of thick stew or a slice of hot meat offered more than nourishment, it offered hope. The anticipation was immense. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, whispers travelled through crowded streets and tenement stairwells as people wondered whether there would be enough food to go around. Charities prepared vast pots of stew made from donated bones and vegetables, stretching every ingredient to feed hundreds. Bakers set aside batches of simple loaves, and wealthier patrons sometimes contributed coins for extra rations. Families who usually dined on watery gruel waited eagerly for this single day when their bowls would actually feel heavy in their hands. On the morning of the feast, the poor gathered early, forming long lines that snaked around church buildings and into frosty streets. Children clutched their parents' coats, stamping their feet to stay warm, as the scent of hot broth drifted through the doors. When at last they entered, the warmth of the room hit them first, a sensation so foreign during winter that some lingered inside just to feel it a little longer. Tables were set with thick slices of bread, heaps of potatoes, and large tureens filled with meat stew. Though simple, it was a bounty compared to their usual fare. The stew especially held a special meaning. It was hearty, often made with chunks of real beef or mutton, rather than scraps or bones. The meat fell apart easily under the spoon, and for many children, this was the only time all year they tasted its full richness. Volunteers ladled generous portions into bowls as people whispered gratitude or simply stared in disbelief at the food before them. Hunger had a way of dulling the imagination. Only when faced with abundance did many realize how empty their diets had been for months. Even the bread tasted different on festival days. It was soft rather than stale, warm rather than cold, and served without the need to ration every bite. Some places even distributed small cakes or pieces of fruit, luxuries that most poor families could never afford. Laughter, music, and the murmur of conversation filled the rooms as people allowed themselves, for just a few hours, to feel part of a community rather than outsiders in their own city. But the emotional power of these meals came from more than flavour or fullness. They symbolised rare recognition. On these days, society temporarily acknowledged the suffering of its weakest members. Volunteers spoke kindly, offered second helpings, and treated the poor not as burdens but as human beings. The effect was profound. A warm meal could restore a sense of dignity that daily life had eroded. It reminded the poor that hunger was not a personal failing, but a consequence of a system that left them behind. Still, the feasts were fleeting. When the food was gone and the halls emptied, people stepped back into cold streets with stomachs full, but futures unchanged. The next morning, many returned to their routines of scavenging, rationing, and enduring. Children looked forward to the next Christmas not for gifts or celebrations, but because it meant another chance to eat their fill. Charities did what they could, but hunger was larger than their efforts. Festival meals were moments of relief, not solutions. The contrast between these rare feasts and the grinding poverty of everyday life emphasized how deeply unequal Victorian society was. The wealthy enjoyed multiple courses at every meal, while the poor survived on crusts and thin broth, except for this single moment of abundance. This imbalance did not go unnoticed. Reformers wrote passionately about the spectacle of people cheering for bowls of stew, while the upper classes wasted food in staggering quantities. Yet little changed. The system relied on these festival meals as a moral shield, a way to claim compassion without addressing the roots of deprivation. For many, these days created bittersweet memories. They offered joy, but also highlighted what was missing during the remaining 364 days of the year. The temporary fullness only sharpened the awareness of long-term hunger. Still, the poor clung to these celebrations because they proved one thing: the human body could feel whole again, even if only briefly. That knowledge alone gave them the strength to keep going. Looking back, it becomes clear that these feasts were not merely acts of charity. They were lifelines that prevented starvation from claiming even more lives during the harshest months. The warmth, the generosity, and the abundance, though small in scale, made an immeasurable difference to those who received them. In a world where survival often depended on scraps, a full bowl of stew could feel like a miracle. These rare meals, heavy with meat and warmth, reveal how a single day of abundance could restore bodies worn thin by months of hunger. They show how charity offered momentary relief, but never the lasting security people desperately needed. As the final lesson of this journey unfolds, the deeper truth emerges. Survival in Victorian Britain depended not just on food, but on resilience, adaptability, and bonds strong enough to withstand a lifetime of scarcity. In the long shadow of Victorian poverty, survival was not a matter of strength, but of adaptability. Every meal described throughout this journey, whether it was stale bread, thin gruel, scraps from a slaughterhouse, or a rare festival feast, reveals how the poor learned to bend their lives around scarcity. They had few choices, and yet they found ways to endure. The story of Victorian survival is, at its core, the story of how ordinary people stretched limited resources, reimagined waste as nourishment, and depended on one another when food itself became a form of privilege. This ability to adapt shaped their days, their diets, and the rhythm of their entire existence. Adaptation began with creativity. The poor transformed ingredients that wealthier families dismissed as useless into meals that sustained them through long work hours and cold winters. Every crust of bread was softened, fried, boiled, or soaked to make it edible for just a little longer. Bones were boiled until they surrendered the last traces of nutrition. Vegetables nearing decay were chopped into soups, herbs gathered from roadsides were added for flavour, and fats were preserved with care so they could stretch across weeks. Resourcefulness was not admirable, it was necessary. Without it, families would have starved long before winter arrived. This creativity carried an emotional weight as well. To turn scraps into sustenance required patience and resilience. Parents spent hours figuring out how to divide food so that every child received enough to stay upright the next day. Workers planned their meals around wages so low that a miscalculation could mean going without dinner. Women rationed ingredients with precision, knowing each spoonful might determine whether the household could function. These small decisions, made daily and often silently, were acts of survival disguised as routine. But adaptation did not stop at food alone. It extended into the social fabric of poor communities. Survival required cooperation, and the poor built networks of support far more reliable than government interventions. Neighbours shared pots of soup, traded scraps, or saved pieces of bread for a sick family next door. Children warned each other about dangerous streets, generous vendors, or places where leftovers might be found. Workers exchanged information about charities distributing meals or markets nearing closing time. Even the practice of raising a backyard pig became a communal effort. Neighbours helped during slaughtering and shared pieces of meat, no matter how small. These gestures formed an unspoken code. No one survived alone. Hunger united people in ways comfort never could. Each act of sharing acknowledged a truth that Victorian society preferred to ignore, that the poor depended on one another because no one else would help them. The upper classes saw hunger as a moral failure, not a structural one. Charities offered temporary relief, but rarely challenged the inequality that produced such widespread deprivation. So the poor did what they always had. They supported each other quietly, consistently, and without expecting recognition. Food in this world was not merely nourishment, it was a symbol of inequality. The rich filled their tables with imported canned goods, roasts, pastries, and fruits brought from distant colonies. They wrote cookbooks celebrating variety, while the poor scraped together meals from whatever they could find. This contrast was not subtle, it was unmistakable. To be wealthy meant choice, flavour, and abundance. To be poor meant monotony, improvisation, and the constant fear of hunger. Even festival feasts, generous as they seemed, underscored the unfairness. A single day of fullness against a year of scarcity. Yet despite this disparity, the poor endured. Their ability to survive on so little, to transform hardship into routine, and to keep moving forward reveals a strength that history often overlooks. These were not people who surrendered easily. They adapted because they had to, but also because they believed that life, no matter how hard, was still worth fighting for. Their survival was not just physical, it was emotional, communal, and deeply human. When we look back at Victorian food culture now, it becomes clear that this was not merely a chapter about hunger, it was a lesson about resilience. The poor found ways to stretch crumbs into meals, but they also found ways to stretch hope across impossible distances. They lived in a society where food was a privilege, nourishment was uncertain, and survival required constant adjustment, and yet they persisted. Their endurance shaped generations, influenced social reforms, and eventually pushed society to question the conditions it once accepted as normal. The true legacy of Victorian survival lies in this quiet persistence. It reminds us that strength is often built under pressure, not abundance. It teaches us that communities born from hardship can hold each other together even when the world refuses to help. It shows that resilience is not heroic in the dramatic sense. It is the slow, steady decision to keep going even when everything feels stacked against you. As this story closes, the images linger. Workers breaking stale bread, children clutching hot potatoes, families gathering around thin soups, homeless people braving winter nights, and rare feasts that offered brief moments of relief. Each scene illustrates a different aspect of survival, but they all lead to the same conclusion. The Victorian poor lived because they adapted, shared, endured, and hoped. Their resilience is the quiet thread running through every chapter of their lives. And so, this final reflection settles like the last ember of a dying fire, warm, brief, and meaningful. The story of Victorian survival is not just about what people ate, but about how they lived through scarcity with dignity and determination. Their world was harsh, but their perseverance was profound. Thank you for staying with this long and quiet journey through a life shaped by hunger, creativity, and resilience. May the calm of this reflection rest gently on your thoughts. Good night, and may your sleep be warm, full, and far from the empty tables of the past.